with thy mighty hand. Keep us free from evil powers. Be our light through countless hours. To our leaders, great defender, grant true wisdom from above. Justice, truth be ours forever. Jamaica, land we love. Jamaica, 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 land we love. Teach us true respect for all. Stir response to duty's call. Strengthen us, the weak to cherish. Give us vision, lest we perish. Knowledge send us, Heavenly Father. Grant true wisdom from above. Justice, truth be ours forever. Jamaica, land we love. Jamaica, 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 land we love.
Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Dawn Martin. Please be seated. Jamaica is blessed with talented individuals. One such person now serves as the ambassador for economic affairs in Jamaica. He is a former member of the Senate and businessman of high repute and former Rhodes, Commonwealth, and Jamaica Independence scholar. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and welcome Dr. Nigel Clark, who will bring the official welcome.
The Most Honorable Andrew Holness, Prime Minister of Jamaica, the Honorable Keith Mitchell, Prime Minister of Grenada, the Honorable Vance Amory, Premier of St. Kitts, Madame Christine Lagarde, Managing Director of the IMF and the IMF delegation, the Honorable Peter Turnquest, Deputy Prime Minister of the Bahamas and Minister of Finance, Mr. Barrett Jagdeo, ex-President of Guyana, Mr. Bruce Golding, former Prime Minister of Jamaica, Dr. Peter Phillips, Leader of the Opposition, members of the Cabinet, visiting finance ministers and ministers of state, members of the diplomatic corps, members of the Senate, governors of central banks in the Caribbean, members of the multilateral communities, members of the private sector, members of the foreign and local media, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to the 2017 High-Level Forum jointly organized by the Government of Jamaica and the International Monetary Fund. We are pleased to have such a broad and full participation, which makes for a vibrant discussion and lasting insights. This forum is being held at a critical time in Caribbean history. With few exceptions, countries of our region are challenged by the trifecta of slow growth, high debt, and vulnerability to natural disasters. These challenges form an interlocking chain of cause and effect that threaten Caribbean life as we know it. It is imperative, therefore, that leaders, policymakers, and citizens of our region engage to urge effective responses. This conference has been designed for exactly that purpose, as a space where regional issues that are of importance to Caribbean economies can be highlighted and ventilated in an environment where potential policy responses can be discussed, analyzed, and examined. Youth unemployment, social deviancy, youth delinquency, and crime have a relationship with slow growth that experts in our first panel will explore. The literature and experience suggest that if we want to accelerate economic expansion, we must concern ourselves with these relationships. While fiscal policy is compelled to respond to democratic forces, is it the case that in the Caribbean, fiscal politics sometimes breach boundaries of prudency based on short-term political considerations, and these breaches conspire to endanger our long-term collective interest? If so, how have other countries reshaped political incentives to curb the predilection to excess? The second panel will examine these critically relevant issues. Over lunch, we'll hear from Peter Blair Henry, Dean of the NYU Stern School of Business, and Peter spent his research career focused on issues concerned with economic growth in developing countries. Our penultimate panel has been constructed on the established premise that finance is the oxygen of business and is largely provided in a regulated environment that seeks to balance stability and growth considerations. Recognizing the potentially catalytic role of asset and credit growth, how should regulation and supervision evolve, if at all? And given the economic power of the base of the pyramid, how can that evolution be best fashioned to broaden inclusion? And we have saved the best for last. The managing director of the fund will moderate a panel consisting of Prime Minister Holness, Prime Minister Mitchell, and Deputy Prime Minister Turnquest to discuss challenges and opportunities in the Caribbean, which will pick up on themes of earlier sessions, and this promises to be a most fascinating discussion that you're not going to want to miss. The IMF has served as a valued partner and trusted advisor to CARICOM countries, all of whom are members of the fund. Jamaica, St. Kitts and Nevis, and Grenada have all had recent experience with fund programs with positive results to show, and all countries of the region benefit from Article 4 consultations and technical assistance that continue to provide valuable advice. Jamaica is therefore pleased to have worked with the IMF in the planning of this conference, and particularly pleased that it coincides with the second visit of Madame Lagarde to Jamaica. Christine Lagarde is a woman of unique and unrivaled distinction. She was chairman of one of the world's leading global law firms, Baker and McKenzie, before becoming Minister of Finance of France, and in so doing, becoming the first woman in history to lead the treasury of a G7 nation. As a finance minister during difficult times, she understands from practical experience fiscal policy and inherent trade-offs. Madame Lagarde was appointed to lead the IMF in 2011, taking charge at a turbulent time in the world economy. She has presided over difficult but ultimately successful interventions in several economies, small and large, in many regions of the world. And in addition, she led the process that culminated in the largest ever capital increase in absolute terms in the IMF's history, doubling the capacity of the IMF to respond to crises. This speaks volumes to the confidence that the 189 members of the IMF have in her leadership and stewardship of the fund. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the podium Madam Christine Lagarde, Managing Director of the IMF.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador, for this very flattering introduction, which I'm not sure I deserve. But I certainly am very, very happy to be back in Jamaica. Most Honorable Prime Minister Andrew Holmes, Prime Ministers, Ministers and Central Bank Governors, representatives of international organizations, public and private sector participants, friends and colleagues, good morning. As I said, it's very nice to be back in Jamaica. And welcome to you all for the 2017 High-Level Caribbean Conference, which we have called Unleashing Growth and Strengthening Resilience. If anything, it's another example of a good partnership between Jamaica, and you are clearly evidence of the fact that it is working. So thank you for sharing your time with us today. I would particularly like to thank Prime Minister Holness for his very strong support for this forum and for actually attending himself and giving the opening address together with me. This forum is actually a very important forum for brainstorming and collaborating with the key stakeholders on the challenges facing the region and the possible solution to address them. We have just recently published a book. I think that it is sitting somewhere on the desks. There you are, excellent. And the book actually comes under the same title as the forum that we have today. And it explores some of the themes that we will be discussing in the course of today's forum. This year's forum is also about hearing your views on how we can better cooperate together in order to deepen Caribbean growth, insulate it more from shocks, and make it more resilient. We all want this region to create more jobs, more growth, for the benefit of current but also future generations. Just before I go a little bit deeper into these issues of growth and resilience, I would like to also express my deepest sympathies to the government of the Caribbean for the loss of life and devastation caused by Hurricane Irma and Maria. And these hurricanes have again highlighted the special vulnerabilities of the Caribbean and the need to strengthen its resilience. I had the pleasure, for sure, but also the duty to go through the devastation of Dominica at the time of our annual meeting in Washington to see how we could actually best help this island, which had suffered so much from the latest occurrence. Climate change is expected to certainly intensify the impact of natural disasters and worsen the vulnerabilities of small states in the Caribbean. Rising sea levels increase risks of erosion and flooding, and warmer water temperatures heighten the potential for more intense hurricanes. We must come together to address the challenge posed by climate change and help those most affected by it. I know that some prime ministers who are due to be here on the occasion of this forum have actually decided to be in Germany at the moment as we speak in order to also carry loudly the voices of the Caribbeans to make sure that others, not directly affected, but probably directly and indirectly responsible, understand the consequences of what is happening around the planet. Emergency relief following events like Hurricanes Irma and Maria is a key responsibility of the global community. The IMF stands ready to do whatever it can to help in those situations in assessing macroeconomic implications, determining the financing needs, and providing financial support that could also help catalyze broader financing from the rest of the international community. All those of you who know the IMF, who have worked with us, know that we are not the suppliers of the massive funding that is necessary, but we can be extremely helpful in utilizing additional support from other donors more equipped to actually provide those fundings. Now, beyond these efforts that are well known and that we have displayed on many occasions and that we will continue to keep available, I would like to make a specific proposal as a follow-up to what has happened and as a more long-term consideration. What we will do is convene an event with all the major public and private stakeholders to explore options, not for pledging funds. That's something that needs to come in due course and initiated by those who can. But to explore the options for building resilience in the region, including risk mitigation, debt management strategies, particularly designed bonds for the future. And in this effort, we will not be traveling alone. We want to do that in a cooperative way and working with the Caribbean authorities and the Caribbean people themselves. But we will also clearly cooperate with all the international financial institutions that are willing, and that certainly would include the World Bank, which I know is extremely focused on those issues and is also taking those matters into its consideration. The Inter-American Development Bank, the Caribbean Development Banks, and other development partners that actually care for not the short-term fix, not plugging the hole, but thinking about how we can actually build prevention, precaution, defenses going forward in order to anticipate what is bound to recur yet again, and probably with much more ferocity than it had. So let me now focus on these issues that we are all concerned about: growth, jobs, benefits for the longer term. It is, of course, an essential foundation for a more resilient Caribbean. So it's also part and parcel of the prevention considerations that we need to have. But unfortunately, economic growth in the Caribbean has been low for several decades. And this has led to rising social and economic challenges, including poverty, inequality, unemployment, and crime. And while some authorities in the region have made the effort in terms of macroeconomic stability, in terms of fiscal efforts, yet growth is somehow resisting those efforts. And it's actually a bit of a puzzle as to why that is. And one really needs to explore what are the reasons, because there is no one as to why growth is still lagging behind despite the efforts that have been undertaken. But of those multiple explanations, there are some that are pretty familiar to many of you. Clearly, the external shocks that we have seen, such as the natural disasters and loss of international trade preferences, as well as the impact on the agriculture, which is still an important source of growth. At the same time, the Caribbeans have not been able to fully insulate themselves from such shocks because of large macroeconomic imbalances. Growth has also been affected by structural impediments, and a few come to mind. The high cost of electricity, limited access to credit for both households and small and medium-sized enterprises, high rates of violent crime, and a persistent outflow of highly skilled workers, the well-known brain drain. So what can we do moving forward to address those issues? Well, that's what is bringing us this morning. And we have tried in organizing this conference with the Jamaican authorities to tackle all those issues in a very comprehensive way. That is why the agenda today covers topics that, frankly, the IMF is not necessarily the expert of, and we will be learning in the process: crime and youth unemployment. More familiar with fiscal policy and political cycles, stability and growth trade-offs in the financial sector. So let me just offer a few thoughts on these topics. Youth unemployment in the Caribbean is among the highest in the world. Crime, partly fueled by this high rate of joblessness, is a major obstacle to growth in the Caribbean. crime imposes several economic costs, including public spending on security and the criminal justice system, private spending on security, and social costs from the loss of income due to the victimization and incarceration. In a recent study, our colleagues from the Inter-American Development Bank found that on average, crime in the Caribbean costs nearly 4% of GDP per year, which is more than in most Latin American countries. So we need to create a virtuous as opposed to a vicious circle, where strong growth would reduce high unemployment, and particularly youth unemployment and crime, which in turn would contribute to boosting productivity and growth and improve this business-friendly environment without which investors are reluctant to invest. On the second aspect, the fiscal policies and the stronger institutions and the political cycles. Politics and electoral cycles can have a strong impact on fiscal policies and economic outcomes, a phenomenon that has been observed around the world and has also played a major role in shaping. Well-designed fiscal rules can help guide consolidation efforts. And indeed, such a rule targeting a reduction in public debt to 60% of GDP over the medium term has been introduced in the region in several countries. The Eastern Caribbean currency unions, and it has had success in putting public debt on a clear downward path in St. Kitts and Nevis, Grenada, and Jamaica. And the experience of these countries, which has been in the main very successful, can provide a good example for other countries in the region. Apart from the fiscal rule, fiscal councils are also increasingly recognized as tools to promote sound fiscal policies by providing independent information and analysis and by monitoring compliance with fiscal rules. And I would certainly like to welcome Andrea Repetto, the president of Chile's Fiscal Advisory Council, who is with us today to share the Chilean experience. Well-designed institutions can also play a key role in securing broad political consensus around important reforms. Jamaica in the Economic Program Oversight Committee, better known by all of us as EPOC, comes to mind. From 2013 onwards, this public-private sector committee has played a central role in monitoring Jamaica's economic reform programs and building support for it. You know, sometimes those who 4 or 5 years ago were saying the program is going to be very difficult, it's uncertain whether it will work, and there were many of those negative thinkers around, well, they have been proven wrong. And I think the courage of the authorities of Jamaica, one after the other, and the inclusive approach that was taken by the authorities through that epoch have really been critically important in actually making sure that the program is actually owned, adopted, and eventually implemented for the benefit of the Jamaican people and its economy. Finally, we need to take a look at financial sector issues, and in particular, the trade-off between financial stability and growth. A well-functioning and healthy financial sector should strike a balance between risk-taking growth and stability. Financial sectors in the Caribbean have historically either taken on too much or too little risk. In countries with high public debt, banks have grown dependent on government paper and have crowded out private sector credit. In other countries, at times, banks have engaged in excessively high lending, leading to struggles with non-performing loans. So where is the right balance between those two? That will be the focus of part of our conversation today, actually this afternoon. And the distinguished panel has also been asked to examine policies to address constraints on financial sector inclusion and deepening of that financial sector. And I'm certainly very much looking forward to their views. Now, when it comes to banking, there is another challenge that we need to look at. Both Caribbean and other economies around the world, by the way, have had to contend with the loss of correspondent banking relationships, otherwise previously known as de-risking. The IMF has facilitated an international dialogue on this issue aimed at fostering a shared understanding of the problem and to help develop policy responses that are tailored to the specific challenges faced by the Caribbean economies, and I think that we have made progress together. Following discussions on this issue at a closed-door event in Barbados, convened by the IMF, which included key stakeholders, that was a year ago, a major correspondent bank has offered to provide technical support to respondent banks in the region. So it's the foreign bank, you mention any nationality here, but suffice to say that it's from afar, has actually accepted to provide that technical support in order to better understand what is the situation and to help the Caribbean banks upgrade their system, improve their processes in order to satisfy the requirements back at home of that other bank. Another achievement, a major money center bank, again I will not mention the name nor the origin, that had left the region has now re-engaged with some banks. Third achievement, Belize, one of the countries that was worst affected, is now recovering from a loss of over 2/3 of its correspondent banking relationships in 2015 and 2016, and currently in Belize, every bank there has at least 2 correspondent banking relationships and can actually process transactions in a timely manner. We have made further progress on this issue more recently, and our IMF legal counsel, Mr. Hagen, will talk about this later today. And there was, on Monday, another closed-door conference that took place on that particular issue with great support from our legal department and other experts in that regard. But notwithstanding those important progress, the issue continues to be a challenge. And let me assure you that we are not giving up on that. It's not only the issue of the status of the correspondent banking relationship, it's also the issue of the costing of those transactions that we will try to help with. So let me conclude with this thought on resilience captured by musician Jimmy Cliff in the soundtrack of the classic movie The Harder They Come. I'll quote, "Listen, Rome was not built in a day. Opposition will come your way, but the harder the battle, you see, is the sweeter the victory now. You can get it if you really want." We know we can get there. We will. Thank you.
Thank you, Madame Christine Lagarde. Ladies and gentlemen, the St. Catherine High School is located in Spanish Town, St. Catherine, the old capital of Jamaica. It's one of Jamaica's prestigious co-educational traditional high schools. It was founded in 1948 by members of the Sisters of Mercy and Jesuit Fathers of the Roman Catholic Diocese. The alma mater of Prime Minister Andrew Holness, St. Catherine High has created waves as a high school with one of the best performing arts ensembles. In 2007, the school won 16 gold medals, 16 silver medals, and 6 bronze medals in the Jamaica Cultural Development Commission Festival of the Arts competitions. They also placed second in the Jamaica Best School Band competition. The school's motto is, "Work, Conquer All." Performing a cultural item, please make welcome the St. Catherine High School Ensemble. Ladies and gentlemen, the St. Catherine High School Ensemble. Let's also thank their teachers, Mr. Kevin Williams, Mr. Kamar Grant, and Ms. Nina McCalla, and of course, Principal, Mr. Marlon Campbell. Prime Minister Andrew Holness is a man with a vision for Jamaica, a vision for a prosperous Jamaica. Delivering the opening address, the Most Honorable Andrew Holness, ONMP, Prime Minister of Jamaica.
Right, Keith Mitchell, Prime Minister of Grenada, the Honorable Vance Amory, Premier of Nevis, representing Prime Minister of St. Kitts and Nevis, Madame Christine Lagarde, the Director now reggae fan. The Honorable Peter Turnquist, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance of the Bahamas. The Honorable Francine Barron, Minister of Foreign Affairs, representing the Prime Minister of Dominica. The Honorable Camille Robinson Regis, Minister of Planning and Development, representing the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. His Excellency Dr. Barrett Jagdeo, former President of Guyana. Dr. Peter Phillips, Leader of the Opposition, members of the Cabinet, ministers of government from the Caribbean community, Senator the Honorable Tom Tavares Finson, President of the Senate, members of the Diplomatic Corps, members of the Senate and the Lower House, governors of Caribbean central banks, financial secretaries and permanent secretaries, members of staff of the International Monetary Fund, panelists and speakers, heads of agencies, departments, heads of trade unions, members of the private sector, members of the media, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, a pleasant good morning to all. Especially to our visitors who have journeyed, some from very far. I was speaking with Madame Lagarde, who told me she traveled 29 hours to get here. We're very happy to have you, Madame Lagarde, and I want to welcome you to Jamaica once again. By now, we should just make you honorary Jamaican. Today's high-level Caribbean Forum is symbolic of the region's journey with the International Monetary Fund. And as the theme suggests, we are now steadfastly focused on moving that relationship beyond stability to one focused on sustained growth and resilience. And so this conference is extremely timely. Let me express my gratitude to Madame Christine Lagarde and the Managing Director of the IMF, who I know is happy to be here in Jamaica. And I also extend special thanks to the team at the IMF for their tremendous work and continued support for Jamaica and its programs. Let me also express sincere appreciation to the Ministry of Finance and Public Service, led by Minister Audley Shaw, to the Bank of Jamaica, led by Brian Winter, and to Ambassador Clark, who coordinates the program from my office. Commendations also to the members of the organizing committee and all who contributed to making this conference a reality. Many Caribbean countries' economic histories have been labeled as stories of paradox and potential. As a region, we possess a variety of natural assets, which, along with our strategic location, enable us to tap into a variety of growing industries and markets. We are close to the world's largest market. We possess a fairly well-trained and educated labor force. And very importantly, we are politically stable. The recent experience with natural disasters seem to suggest that we are in an era characterized by disturbing regularity of hurricanes and other natural disasters with increased intensity. These hazards have destabilizing and potentially wrecking effect on Caribbean economies and society. And we will require further collaboration and cooperation as a region to rebuild resilience and response capacity. The background reality is that given the scale and the ferocity of these naturally occurring phenomena, with economic impact measured in triple-digit units of GDP, Caribbean will, for the foreseeable future, be dependent on external response capacity. Have the effect of shifting world powers, with the Caribbean competing with their domestic populations for resources in a manner that becomes sustainable to maintain without a demonstrable effort by the Caribbean to develop its own internal capacity to respond. There is no doubt that effective domestic response capacity is most feasibly pursued through joint collaborative effort with pooled resources from the Caribbean. That process has begun with entities, Disaster Emergency Management Agency, CDEMA, and the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility. While the capacities in these organizations may be limited, they have assisted, but far more needs to be done by Caribbean governments to increase our collaboration and cooperation, really increase the capacity of these agencies. Ladies and gentlemen, organized crime, the international narcotics trade, smuggling of arms are becoming significant features and threats to the region. As Madame Lagarde mentioned, these may not be areas of expertise of the IMF, but nevertheless, in dialogue and in conference, we will develop the solutions together, because the truth is that the solutions are all interconnected. What we can all testify to as Caribbean leaders is that our fiscal capacity affects our capacity to deal with all the threats that face our nations. We have historically thought of boundaries from a national frame of reference. But we all live in one Caribbean Sea. And therefore, the way in which we look at the Caribbean in terms of how we think of its security will have to change. We have to police the Caribbean Sea border as if it were one country. Countries trying to police their own borders. And that means a greater level of collaboration on security matters for the region. Another area that we should look at in this conference, and I'm sure it's a challenge for all Caribbean leaders, is the free movement of labor. We tend to look at the free movement of goods, but we don't see it as a necessary companion to that, the free movement of labor. It becomes a particular concern when viewed against the backdrop of natural disasters. Can you imagine a sustained economic fallout in our sister islands? How will those economies recover if there is not a mechanism, a framework to allow free movement of labor, even temporarily, to help as part of the recovery and relief? An interesting situation occurred during and after the weather events that affected our respective countries, that many students had to complete their studies in other sister countries that were not affected. And indeed, it is this capacity for our respective economies and countries to open our society, open our schools, open our economy. That will give us, as a Caribbean, the ability to respond to disasters. We should look at, whilst looking at the broader context, economic growth. We have made some progress in these areas, and I don't want it to seem as if we have not. But my personal view here today is that greater effort needs to be. And the threat to all our countries that climate change poses should give us greater impetus to look at all the ways in which we, as a Caribbean people, as Caribbean countries, can have greater cooperation. As countries, we're all faced with the challenge of growth. We in Jamaica, we have been very ambitious. We have said that we intend to achieve 5% growth in 4 years. That was last year, so it's 5% growth in 3 years. And, people have said it's an overly ambitious target, but I have never been known to do anything that is unambitious. And I'm strongly of the view that we will achieve the growth targets set. But we're also very cognizant of the significant challenges that the Jamaican economy faces, but these challenges are not unique. These are features of Caribbean economies. And some of these challenges, as Madame Lagarde mentioned in her presentation, domestic imbalances, high public debt, vulnerability to natural disaster, as we said earlier, and external shocks, high energy costs. And not just high energy costs, but for many Caribbean countries in the region, energy security is a significant issue. Migration of highly skilled workers, the brain deal for Caribbean countries. But we have significant structural problems as well that impede growth. Structural problems like inefficient bureaucracies within our public sector that need real and deep reforms to make them more efficient and more responsive and effective in service delivery and in carrying out their regulatory and permitting duties. The International Monetary Fund has been an important partner and a constant source of support for the region in implementing various reforms to end the cycle of low growth and high debt. You've mentioned some cases of success. Grenada, Jamaica has been two of the more recent examples. Jamaica's previous extended facility and our current precautionary standby arrangement, notably across political administrations, are yielding dividends. Not only has Jamaica met all structural marks through to the end of September 2017, but the focus on fiscal discipline, process efficiency, and managing our monetary program is producing positive impacts. A positive impact on inflation. Inflation continued to remain low in Jamaica. Non-borrowed net international reserves stood at 1.8 billion at the end of, and let me just repeat that, 1.8 billion US dollars at the end of June, about $1 million US above the program performance criterion. Jamaica continues to access local and international capital markets at competitive rates. The central bank is cautiously lowering policy rates, and lower real interest rates are becoming a reality in the Jamaican economy. But what I'm particularly proud of is that unemployment is declining. According to the latest quarterly economic performance review from the Planning Institute of Jamaica, the unemployment rate as at July 2017 was 11.3%, representing the lowest quarterly rate recorded since 2009. That's 8 years ago. This was 1.6 percentage points lower than the rate recorded for July 2016 and 0.9 percentage points lower than April 2017. But of note is that youth unemployment declined by 2.1 percentage points to 27.5%. So we are making progress, and significant progress, in reducing our debt, increasing our economic stability, but taking on a posture for growth. The economic thinking in the Caribbean on growth is always constrained by the fiscal realities. For many Caribbean governments, we are not able to spend our way to growth. That is our reality. So we have to think harder to develop policies that foster growth. We have to focus on ensuring that we build a strong partnership with the private sector, because ultimately it is the private sector that is the engine of growth. That is, for us, the Jamaican experience. And what we have been doing as a government is to develop that strong partnership with the private sector and to support the private sector. That leads us to another policy imperative, because the partnership with the private sector cannot be merely words. The partnership with the private sector has to be real. And so we pay close attention to the ease of doing business, because that's the real partnership. How easy it is for our business people, our investors, to actually do what only they alone can do best: invest. We pay close attention to the Doing Business report. In 2018, while Jamaica fell by 3 spots to the number 70th rank, the report recognized the number of reform programs being undertaken to enhance the business climate in Jamaica. Jamaica was one of 34 countries whose economy improved the most across 3 or more doing business topics in 2016-2017. We improved in starting a business. Jamaica made starting a business faster by reinstating next-day service for company incorporation. Getting electricity. Jamaica improved the reliability of the electricity supply in Kingston, investing in the distribution network through several initiatives, including the installation of smart meters and distribution automation switches. And we made improvements in trading across borders. Jamaica reduced the time for be an improvement in Jamaica's ranking in the Doing Business report. We have already started to take several steps in this regard, one of which I'd like to mention, where a few days ago in our Senate, we passed a bill, the National Identification Registration Act, which will establish a national registry and create a national identification system. This will significantly improve commerce in Jamaica. It will reduce the identity aspect of transaction costs on the basis of creating a digital economy. We will see significant improvements in our ease of doing business index. We're also ensuring that there are significant improvements to our financial inclusion in Jamaica. We see financial inclusion as important to expanding our productive base. We see it as important for encouraging greater innovation. But probably important thing to attaining growth is public sector transformation. This is key to the government becoming a facilitator and enabler for growth. Reorienting the public sector to one that is dynamic, efficient, and innovative bodes well for sustainable growth. Increased asset diversification, mergers, and closures are strategies being utilized as appropriate in the rationalization process. In Parliament a few days ago, we passed a legislation that effectively marked the beginning of Jamaica's program of public sector reform, where after developing a rationalization plan, we closed an agency of the government that was no longer providing or needed to provide the services for which it was formed. The bill had its usual robust debate, but I felt that there was hope because the opposition in their comments and in the debate called for a full debate in the House of the reform program, not in a combative way, but in a way that signaled the necessary political maturity that is needed for the government or any government to carry through these very difficult structural reforms. And I departed from my presentation here because I'm certain that in the discussions that will follow, the intersection between good economic policies and good politics will come up. None of what we are trying to achieve, which are all checked in the textbook as good policies, can only come to reality if there is politics. And so the last thing I would close on in recommending is that to get to good politics, we have to practice partnerships. And Madame Lagarde, you mentioned the EPOC Oversight Committee. We have established several other oversight committees and by the way, you might like this name, the Public Sector Transformation Oversight Committee. We have established an Economic Growth Council to oversee the government's commitment to growth. And we have maintained EPOC coming across administration. It is vitally important that leaders bring, firstly, the critical stakeholders to the table to have that discussion, because you will need them to carry the discussion to the populace that will vote, to make these good policies a part of the political economy so that they rank highly in the scale structure of the voter when they go to make decisions. So things that are made by one administration is not eroded when they face an electorate. So, ladies and gentlemen, Jamaica is very happy to be hosting. We're very happy to have the IMF. We're looking forward to discussions. And what I would really like to get out of this is that the profound points that are going to be made, and I see the panelists that are here, that these get filtered into mainstream media where the average Jamaican, the average Caribbean person can get access to what is being discussed here so that it helps to create the emergence of a new consciousness within our electorate to ensure that all that we are discussing here can be implemented. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, and I wish for a successful conference.
Thank you, Prime Minister Andrew Holness. And that concludes, ladies and gentlemen, this morning's opening ceremony. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll now have a 5-minute recess so that we can have a photo session with all the members seated at the delegates' table with the Prime Minister of Jamaica and the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund. So may we have all those seated at the delegates' table, please, on stage so that we can have a quick photo session with both Madame Lagarde and Prime Minister Holness. The photographers Yomo Hutchinson and Richard Hamilton will guide the delegates toward the stage so that we can have that group photo. Again, delegates at the table, can you head to the stage so we can have that photo session with Prime Minister Holness and Madame Lagarde. For those remaining for the remainder of the conference, we will have a 5-minute break. Session 1 will begin in 5 minutes. Session 1 will focus on the Caribbean Growth Challenge, crime, and youth unemployment. So again, can we, given that we have 5 minutes, quickly move to the stage for those who are seated at the delegates table for that quick photo session. All those who are seated at the delegates table, please make your way onto the stage so we can have this photo session. The photographers organizing in front will be Mr. Yoma Hutchinson and Mr. Richard Hamilton.
The main agenda for this year's forum takes place today with over 300 participants from within the region as well as without the region. We're talking about current heads of government, former heads of government, central bank governors, finance ministers, and representatives from national organizations. Now, the opening ceremony just took place, and at this moment what's happening is a photo session with the senior representatives from the IMF and the countries, neighboring countries here in the Caribbean that are here. So they're on the platform right now, taking that photo up. Let me tell you what took in the just ended opening session. The Dr. Nigel Clark, Ambassador for Economic of Jamaica, provided the opening statement, and he was followed by the Managing Director of the IMF, Christine Lagarde. Now, Ms. Lagarde is visiting Jamaica for the time since 2014. At that time, time when she visited the country was executing the extended credit facility under the PNP administration. And of course, we're at another juncture where another IMF program is being executed, and so her visit at this point is considered to be very significant. Now, the 2017 High-Level Caribbean Forum is being staged in Jamaica for the second time. The first having been in 2014 in Montego Bay. Now, this year, the forum spans 3 days, in fact, even though today is the major agenda for this year's staging. Now, yesterday, there were some events that were held involving the IMF director, and tomorrow there are some other events that will take place. I suspect that yesterday there were the meetings with, apart from the Prime Minister and the opposition leader, women's leaders in Jamaica, as well as private sector stakeholders. Now, what's on the agenda for tomorrow is a book will be launched by the IMF, which also has the same theme as the forum, that of unleashing growth and strengthening resilience in the Caribbean, focusing on the topics that will be covered today, as well as a range of wider topics examining the challenges facing the Caribbean and solutions that are necessary to bridge the gap between low growth development and sustainable development. Now, that book launch will take place at the UWI. That's tomorrow, Friday. And there will also be another event that the IMF Managing Director will be participating in at the UWI. She will be participating in what's called conversation with UWI students, the Faculty of Sciences at 10 a.m. I'll give you briefly a rundown of the major issues that will be on today. They will be examining the Caribbean Growth Challenge, crime, youth unemployment, and how to take that cycle to spur growth, provide employment, to put an end to the high crime region. As you know, the region is referred to as those parts of the world with the highest crime rate. They will also be examining policy and political cycles, and how political cycles, when there is a change in administration, this is the execution of policies that have been implemented. Now, another area that will be discussed, financial sector stability and growth trade-offs. Of course, that all-important correspondent situation that continues to face the Caribbean, and the IMF director says that the IMF plans to lend a significant hand in this regard, and I hope that the State Minister in the Ministry of Finance and Public Service, the Honourable Favour Williams, who has just joined me, can shed some light in whatever regard on that topic. Welcome to PBC Jamaica's coverage, Honourable Williams. Now, let's begin, even before I get to the whole issue of the correspondent banking matter, which you joined at that juncture. Let's talk a little bit about this forum, and especially about its significance for Jamaica at in time with the executing and success, as the IMF commended the country on its execution of the program.
Right, totally agree, good execution. There's been good execution from a macro perspective and from a number of other fronts. What we're not seeing just yet is robust growth that this country needs to really get our unemployment down to single-digit level, to get more people working, and so we can see that we can experience that 5% growth. A lot of us here in Jamaica, we've never experienced beyond a 1% growth, so we don't know what it feels like, you know, to just have significant and continual job creation, the flexibility of moving around in jobs so you don't feel stuck. So that's the economy that we want to get to, dynamic, just moving in giving people opportunities to better their lives.
But how does the JLP administration plan to get there? Recently I heard the Prime Minister trumping the BPO sector and the potential that's there. But yes, the BPO sector, but what else? The how? How do we get to that point of providing those jobs so that there can be sustained growth?
Right, well, so far, based on the numbers that have been released by Statin, we are seeing approximately 29,000 more jobs this year than last year. So that's a good start. Where we are in terms of our unemployment rate now, 11.3%, lowest since 2009. So jobs are being created in different areas. When you look across the 16 sectors of the economy, except for agriculture and mining and quarrying, all the other sectors are growing. So our tourism is growing, our water sector is growing, electricity sector, telecommunication sector, they're all growing. We know the problems with the agricultural sector in terms from a weather-related perspective. Mining and quarrying, remember that's an industry that when we inherited it, it was not growing. Plants were closed. But you're looking at significant investment that has come into that industry, trying to get it open and going again, and we're expecting good things from mining and quarrying, which is essentially the bauxite industry.
And the mining minister made some big announcements about that recently. But I just want to hear a little bit more in terms of what are the areas that you plan, or what are the projects that are to come on stream that your administration is targeting, that we can expect some new jobs to be coming out of to add to those jobs that have been provided
right.
this year.
Well, again, there'll be more growth in the business process outsourcing sector. There, at the pipeline of build-out that's there is significant, because as you're well aware, these companies, when they come into Jamaica, they don't come in to build space. They come in to buy space that's already there, so you have to have it before they come. Tourism industry, even though that's a sector that has been with us for a very long time, new things are happening there, and we're seeing fantastic numbers in the tourism sector. The minister there has been talking about the just that he wants to create in the tourism product. He wants to be viewed as a destination that where people come. You talk about the gastronomy, creating that experience. It's health and wellness. It's shopping. So those are, it's putting a new life into an existing industry. There is much development that can happen in our water sector. Seriously, much more can happen in our telecommunications industry. So it's not, we don't have to go and create things for jobs to happen. We can simply look at what we have and begin to bring new products and services to the market. And as long as we continue adding jobs, getting more people into the workforce, it will start to create a virtuous circle. And that's where you begin to see growth pick up on itself and just kind of roll forward.
The Prime Minister spoke about the public sector rationalization program and the importance of efficiency and getting at that stage with our public sector rationalization program.
Okay, we've done a number of things already. The rationalization that he's was talking about has to do with our public bodies. There are over 200 public bodies as separate from central government. The study was done that looked at categorizing them to see which one of them is duplicating function that needs to be merged back into its parent ministry. Which one needs to be closed because the function is no longer needed, which needs to be merged. So we've done that, and you've seen some examples of that already. HEART being merged with NYS, with Center for Lifelong Learning, with the apprenticeship program. You're seeing it with this CDA, Child Development Agency, and the OCR. You're seeing it in the regulatory body in the gaming industry, the Jamaica Racing Commission, and casino gaming, you're seeing those regulators, and three or four of them merged together. You've seen as well concession that was granted to Kingston Freeport last year. So they now are managing activities on the port. 600 jobs that were on the government's payroll went with them. Since then, they've invested quite a bit of money and they've added jobs there. Another example is the racetrack at Caymanas Park. That was a money-losing venture for the government for years. We finally made a decision last year that was sold to Supreme Ventures. They've invested in it. They've hired on more people. So it's those kinds of activities that you start with. Those are the low-hanging fruit, and then you work your way through. The government is a big entity, big organization. It's going to take some time for us to work through, but the important thing is we've done the study, we've started the work to make government more efficient.
So you have the bodies that are part of the rationalization program, and then you have the human bodies. But before we get to the human bodies element, and especially in light of what the Prime Minister has been saying about transitioning them into the private sector if and when it gets to that point, let's talk about the wage negotiations and the stage that they're at. They're at a sticking point right now, and the teachers, the nurses, the police officers, they're not budging as it pertains to that 6%. How is the government going to go about that, considering that the IMF stricture and keeping within those lines? How are you going to straddle that?
Well, first of all, I want to recognize Minister Rudyard Spencer as the lead minister in that area, and so I'm going to defer to him, but what I will say is you are absolutely right. Within our fiscal responsibilities law, the country has agreed, the taxpayers have agreed that we need to get to 9% wage to GDP by 1819, and we just have to move towards it, right? It's not something that's negotiable at this point in time, that 9%. So we have to find ways, and I know the dialogue has been going on between, all the various entities, but I'd encourage you, maybe on your next program, to bring on Minister Spencer. No, honestly, because he's leading the effort, and we try to stay within our portfolios, just so that we have coherency.
Can you speak about the de-risking area?
Yes, it's been just a problem. De-risking refers to international banks that have relationships with our local Jamaican banks. They've taken the decision that different areas of the world pose a risk to them. The Caribbean they see as one such area. And so essentially, there was a time when they simply closed off accounts of our banks, and in turn, or indicated that they were going to. So what that meant was, let's say you're one of the local banks and you have to clear through an international banks, and they say to you, well, Caribbean has come up on our radar. We're thinking of, closing your account. What that does to the local bank is like, they sit up and go, wow, what do we need to do so you don't take that action? And they say, well, you're dealing with XYZ, legal and normal in our context. So for example, they look at remittance and they think, there's room there for just money's coming into the economy that's from questionable sources. Not understanding that remittance is our lifeblood here in Jamaica. A lot of our diaspora members send back monies to help many families here in Jamaica. So they take a global approach to something that for us is kind of, serious and critical. So it's these issues that we've called on bodies like the IMF to help to put a voice to it as well, to help us so that these big international banks for whom the Caribbean is a decimal point, to begin to say, no, it isn't just a decimal point. Take a look, go deeper, look at what you're doing, because you're causing a part of the world to really be experiencing financial just difficulties in how their financial system works, and it's going to have consequences that we don't want. So we've called on global institutions to help us to create a louder voice for this.
The IMF director said that recovery is underway in some countries, and she specifically identified Belize, and also announced that the international bank to provide technical support to help the region to sort out this de-risking issue. What can you give us in terms of an update on Jamaica's de-risk situation?
Well, I know we've had many conversations in Jamaica. We made representation to the different banks that operate, the different relationships that are here. We've been working it in the scenes to ensure that whatever disclosure is required, it's given. We have changed laws. Most recently, we changed the Companies Act to recognize beneficial interest, meaning when you register a company, you need to also say exactly who are the parties in the company. No longer can you not name everyone. So those are some of the things that we're doing to hopefully say we are transparent, we are observing all the anti-money laundering measures that you're requiring of us. So you have to reciprocate. Yes.
Thank you very much. Minister of State in the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service, the Honorable Favor Williams, speaking with me here in the Grand Suite. The name of the suite is the Grand Jamaica Suite at the Jamaica Pegasus Hotel, where the 2017 High-Level Caribbean Forum is taking place. We are about to return to the platform where the first session of the day is about to take place under the theme, the Caribbean Growth Challenge, Crime and Youth Unemployment. Stay with us.
We do need to begin the first session, so may I just ask that you be seated so we can promptly begin. Thank you so much. Robin Wigglesworth, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much for that. It is an absolute pleasure and honor to be here. It's been a few years since I went to Jamaica. Things are actually looking a lot better now than when I was here 4 years ago. There are still some challenges here, of course, and across the entire Caribbean. I have a fantastic panel to tackle one of the biggest issues that confronts the entire region, which is crime and youth unemployment, and to what extent that retards economic growth. We're going to kick off with a couple of presentations from Professor Anthony Clayton of the University of the West Indies and Dr. Elizabeth Ward, who's the chairman of the Violence Prevention Alliance here in Jamaica. Professor Clayton, maybe if you start us off then.
Sure, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Prime Minister, Prime Ministers, Madame Lagarde, enchanté. Can I have the PowerPoint slides, please? So I'm going to give a little context to some of the discussions we're having today about crime and corruption, the economic and social cost. First, please. First, I have to give you a little bit of context, because I think this problem is widely misunderstood. We're worried about terrorism, we're worried about conflict. In 2015, we had less than 30,000 deaths globally as a result of terrorism, of which about 3/4 were in just 5 countries: Iraq, Afghanistan, Nigeria, Pakistan, and Syria. We have, on an average year, less than 50,000 deaths in active conflict. It was up in 2015, obviously, because of the situation in Syria. In an average year, 450,000 crime-related and domestic violence homicides every year, which means that we're really, we're not giving it commensurate attention. Crime kills in an average year about 15 times more people than terrorists, and about 10 times more than die in active wars. So if this were a war, it would be the largest war in the world today, but we do not give it commensurate attention. About half of all the world's non-conflict homicides occur in just 20 countries. And every one of those 20 countries is either in Latin America and the Caribbean or in sub-Saharan Africa. And together they have 10% of world population. So 10% of the population of the planet are taking 50% of the casualties. Global costs of violence estimated at a little under $10 trillion a year. And those costs are largely borne by those same 20 countries. Next slide, please. This is what the distribution, the global distribution, actually looks like. What this shows is that the average level of homicide in relatively stable parts of the world, like the European Union, is about 1 per 100,000. Excuse me for having to wrestle with the furniture there. In African developing countries, it's about 11 per 100,000. Now, obviously, that has effect and pulls up the world average, which is a little under 7 per 100,000. Over here, where we are, Latin America and the Caribbean has 8% of the population of the planet and about a third of all the killing in the world today. In that large ring here, this is for Latin America and the Caribbean, the average homicide rate is about 32 per 100,000. But in that small inner circle there, we have the epicenter of world violence, where the homicide rate inside that inner ring is about 52 per 100,000. We have, of the 10 most violent nations in the world, 8 of them are in Central America and the Caribbean. Next slide, please. And what this shows us now in closer detail is which countries are affected. Every country that you see here with a red arrow is in the world's top 10 for homicide. And the countries marked with a blue arrow are in the world's top 20 for homicide. A number of factors implicated in this. The fact that we are one of the world's major corridors for transshipment of illegal narcotics and illegal weapons. But the gangs that grew up on these activities have diversified their full-spectrum operations. They're involved in a wide range of other criminal activities, including extortion and increasingly cybercrime. The ready availability of weapons coming out of, obviously, the United States, but increasingly now, as a result of the economic problems in Venezuela, weapons starting to come out of Venezuela as well. Deep-rooted, long-standing social and economic problems, and in some cases, weak or corrupt governments. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. This is where we are now. What this shows is one of our crime epicenters, violent crime epicenters, the parish of St. James. As of December of last year, the homicide rate in the parish reached 141 per 100,000. It's actually a little higher than that now. Now, this is really quite astonishing because the homicide rate in Afghanistan in the government-controlled areas is about 33 per 100,000. So you're actually probably 4 or 5 times more likely to be killed in St. James than you are on active deployment in Afghanistan. Now, most people don't actually feel the same, have the same sense of risk, and that is actually largely because the violence is quite concentrated into particular geographical areas. But this killing, a lot of this killing is happening less than 3 miles away from where the tourists' resorts are, and yet it does not affect the tourist resorts. In the 2013-2017 National Security Policy, it actually what we did was we put our national homicide rate on a par with that of the United States. We looked at 9/11. We said, how many people died on 9/11? It's about 3,000. What's that as a percentage of the population? And then we looked at our homicide rate and realized it's about 50 times higher. So Jamaica actually suffers the equivalent of a 9/11 incident every week. And yet we've become, this is our normal. We've become habituated to this. We're actually used to this. And yet we have to point out, this is not normal. This is highly atypical. Homicide rates around most of the planet have been falling since 1985 for reasons which we do not fully understand. But there's just 2 parts of the world where homicide rates have remained persistently high. And as I said, one of them is sub-Saharan Africa, and the other one is here, where we live. Next slide, please. We actually have 2 main forms of crime. They're interlinked in a number of ways. One of them is economic crime for profit, which may involve intimidation and violence. And these are typically powerful people involved in corruption, misappropriation of funds, trafficking, fraud, increasingly money laundering, and of course tax evasion. And then we have the headline problem, which is violence, which has a number of contributing factors: status, power, reprisal, money. About 20% of it is domestic, and about 80% is gang-related. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. there's an interlocking pattern of underlying problems. And this is why, of course, the problem is so intractable, because you can't just fix one of these things and expect everything to come right. There are issues with entrenched poverty, high levels of inequality, poor educational opportunities, and very few job opportunities. We have many children, probably over 100,000, who've left school with no qualifications. They are effectively unemployable in the formal economy. Against that, we have a background of social decay, broken families, neglected and abused children with early exposure to violence, gang-dominated informal settlements with very poor quality housing, ready availability of illegal narcotics and weapons. We have between 20-25% of our population living on captured land, a third of our population stealing electricity, and about 2/3 of the water supplied by a main utility is either lost or stolen, which means we have many children being raised in households where theft is normal. And of course, it's very hard to expect them to become decent citizens given that background. We've still got major issues with corruption and patronage and links, the compromising of our politics with links with organized crime, largely unreformed policing, a very broken, dysfunctional justice system. And of course, this becomes self-perpetuating, because where you have these high levels of violence, it's a very effective deterrent to capital formation and inward investment. Next slide, please. Now, the IDB report, which was already mentioned this morning, concluded that costs of crime was about 4% of our GDP. Now, if you've read the report, there's actually a copy in the book that's on the table. It includes things like the direct costs, value of lost life, injury, imprisonment, private spending on security, justice, prison services, and so forth. But you also have to take into account the indirect effects. Now, this is things like the deterrent effect to investment, the loss of skilled human capital, and reduced propensity to save and invest. If you actually, and these are somewhat harder to measure, but I think they're probably almost of the same order of magnitude. Our best estimate is that you're actually looking at a collective total of something like 7% of GDP. Next slide, please. Now, of course, some people, when you say, well, okay, it's costing us 7%, they actually think, well, okay, doesn't sound too bad. I've still got 93 cents in every. But as our IMF colleagues can tell us, it's the compound interest that kills you. Actually accumulate the impact over time, and we went back to 1972, which is when the level of violence really started to rise. The cumulative cost of 7% of GDP was about $16.7 billion US. Now, for comparison, our total public debt at about the same time was $18.7 billion, which meant that the cumulative losses of crime were the equivalent of about 90% of our total public debt. In other words, had we not had to put up with that level of hemorrhage, then we would not only be, we would be in one of the strongest fiscal positions of any country in the world. Next slide, please. And this is, unfortunately, you will not be able to read this. This is the year along the bottom there. But what this shows is that through the 1950s and 1960s, this was one of the fastest growing economies in the world. We were averaging about 4.5% growth per annum during that period. Early 1970s, when the level of violence really started to rise, you can see the effect on our economy over the subsequent 3 decades. We went from, on average, 4.5% GDP growth per annum to less than 1%. And that, I think, gives another measure of the impact of crime on a society, violence in particular. Next slide, please. Oh, incidentally, sorry, could you jump back one slide? I just wanted to make the point that we also asked the counterfactual question, where would we have been today if we had not had these problems? And we calculated this 2 different ways. One is just to say, well, if we'd had the same average level of growth as for the rest of the Caribbean region, this economy today would be about 3 times bigger. But if, in fact, we'd stayed on that high growth path, and we were the strongest economy in the Caribbean up until this happened, then today the economy would be 10 times bigger. We'd be on a par with Singapore. Now, we have to think about how do we fix this. There's really 2 strategies we need to pursue. The first is the economic crimes obviously have to be intelligence-led. We have to identify not just the criminals, not just the perpetrators, the corrupt attorneys, business people, etc., who are laundering the funds. Organised crime cannot operate without facilitators. They have to have people who are willing to move the money for them. And as the White House strategy to combat organised crime points out, the best way to take down organised crime is actually to target the facilitators. They cannot operate without them. With violence, we need a whole-of-government, multi-agency approach. The only long-term solution is to find ways to normalise and reintegrate our troubled, highly violent communities. Next slide, please. Now, I was looking around for various possible models as to how we can do this, and this is just one of the available models. This is in Brazil. This is the city of Rio. They have about 22% of the total population living in over 1,000 favelas. These are like ghetto communities spread throughout the city. In 2005, the homicide rate for the city as a whole was 42 per 100,000, extremely high. The homicide rate in the favelas was over 80. The police are not sure because so many of the bodies were never recovered. Their best guess is between 80 and 90 per 100,000. In 2008, they started a new initiative, the Pacifying Police Program, somewhat like our ZOSOs today. By 2012, and this is just 4 years later, they'd got the city homicide rate down by 43%. It was down to 24 per 100,000. But in some of the favelas, the homicide rate was close to zero. And this is an absolutely astonishing achievement in a very short space of time. That one down at the bottom there, Favela Santa Marta, was the very first to be normalized, but others then followed. Next slide, please. This is the actual normalization process. They give the gangs a week's warning that they're coming in, because the object is not to have a firefight with the gangs in the middle of a heavily built-up area. The object is to secure the community. So they actually give them a week's warning. Then they go in massive strength. But the paramilitaries and the army only stay there for 3 months. During that time, they're doing a lot of infrastructure work. They're putting in the new police stations for the pacifying police. The pacifying police go in and they say, we are here for 25 years. Please note, Prime Minister, not 60 days. This is a 25-year program, because really what's involved is a program of cultural re-engineering. And then during that 25-year period, they're fixing the infrastructure, they're giving tax breaks to the private sector to encourage inward investment into those communities. And then, of course, the program as a whole is going on to the next favela. Next slide, please. So this was the first favela to be normalized in 2008. That's a little community there, built up a very steep hillside. About 8,000 people living there and 2,500 houses over about 800 feet of vertical ascent. Next slide, please. Now, this is a situation which actually has a lot of resonance for us here. Because if you have a house up in the favela there, a few years ago, you could have bought a house for $5,000 US. Today, because it's normalized, it would cost you probably $25,000 US. But you're looking down on houses that would cost you $250,000. And further over there, your house would cost you $2.5 million. And you've got the better view. Now, if anybody here has been up in the Montego Hills, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. You've got a fabulous view from up there, and your property's worth nothing. Now, if we could find ways to normalize and regularize these communities, the people who live there would be sitting on enormous capital assets, which would be absolutely life-transforming, not to mention economically transforming. Next slide, please. And they make a point of having these police officers, ignore the guy in the middle, these guys are recruited straight from training school. They go through special training to do pacifying policing. They're typically younger, less violent, less corrupt than the rest of the police force. Next slide, please. Oh, I do want to emphasize that I'm not making a comment about the JCF at this point. It's just that if you have officers who are specialized in this kind of pacification work, then you can't really just take hardened police officers and expect them to become nice guys overnight. We actually have to have special training for the police who do this kind of work. And this is just one example of the kind of very smart social intervention they're doing. Children file police reports, and they file police reports saying what they want for Christmas. And they put their names and age and date of birth and address on it. Now, what this means is that they're getting a Christmas present, but what it also means is that the police, for the first time, are getting a proper register of who lives in a community. And they have a situation which we struggle with too, where you have many people who go by multiple aliases and the police actually don't know who they are. So this is a way of actually resolving that problem. The police then put out an all-points bulletin for the wanted items on their Facebook page, And, next slide, please. Next slide. The toys then start coming in to the police station. Next slide. And then Father Christmas, police officer here, actually goes round and gives the presents to the children, which is wonderful. Now, these are going to children who've never had a present before in their lives. And this is absolutely remarkable. Next slide. And you have a little library inside the police station. And this is where the children go to do their after-school homework. It's like a little homework club inside the police station. What this means is you have a whole generation now growing up who actually see the police as their friends and their protectors. This is actually incredibly smart and effective. Next slide, please. It doesn't solve all of the problems overnight. As you can see, a lot of the favela is still in very poor condition. Next slide. With very poor quality housing. Next slide. But even if you live in a shack made of tin and tar paper, you get an address. Your street, even if it's a little muddy strip of ground, gets a name, and your house gets a number. And what that means is that people who live there actually get a proper address for the first time ever. And the city crews come in and they put concrete down on the mud to actually make it possible for people to walk. Oh, just jump back 1 second. And the power crews come in. They take down the illegal hookups and they put in regular power supplies, and people actually are encouraged to start paying for their power. So this is all part of a multi-pronged effort to normalize these communities and get them back into a normal, decent way of life. Next slide, please. And what we can see is businesses springing up. Now, this was in a community that before they got this program had no legitimate businesses at all. There were no businesses operating inside this community. And when I went there a couple of years ago, they had probably something like 20 restaurants, 4 childcare centers, a dance school, cooking schools, supermarkets. So what this means is that once you fix the security environment, you then have all of this business development activity going on, which suggests that really it's been suppressed for a very long time. And we know why it's been suppressed, because as soon as you start to improve your circumstances, the gangs extort you. So you actually have a very strong incentive not to make it appear that you're making money. Once you remove that pressure, people can actually start saving, investing, and building up businesses. Next slide, please. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have problems. We have profoundly serious problems, but those problems are solvable. We could actually deal with the problems with organized crime. We could deal with our problems with high levels of violence. And I think we could probably, with sufficient will and a good plan, we could do it in under 5 years. So, Prime Minister, I think we can give you your 5% if we just fix this problem. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. Actually, Dr. Ward, if you wait a second, we're going to move the chairs down on the floor to facilitate all the presentations, I think. That was fascinating.
Be very pleased to be here with all of you this morning, and we would be looking more from a public health point of view, how we have approached and some of the potential ways that we can deal with the crisis that we see as a result of the violence that Professor Clayton has taken. One of the things, and this data is based on extensive work that has been done over many years, is that we have really outlined 10 points that would be able to help us systematically address and implement some of the issues that Prof has mentioned. One of the things we really have to do, though, is to make sure that we actually implement a rule of law, and that law is the norm in all our communities, And this needs to really be done on a bipartisan way, and we have to make sure that all members of the population buy into it. Next. We need to make sure that we have a sustained presence of the JDF. We have a history of them having a very positive, though short-term effect. Next. We need to use our approach to community management. And one of the most effective methods that we have seen is the use of the homegrown peace management initiative that looks at the community response and looks at building the peace at the community level. Next. So this methodology really is using therapeutic interventions, peace building, and making sure that the communities, development committees take ownership and they work effectively with the security forces and with the development committees. Next. So this is a story of one of the communities where this was utilized. This is a story of Greater Brownstown, where they were having about 65 murders in a population of about 15,000. You could work out the 100,000s, all the mathematicians. The PMI, working in collaboration with many other groups and the Community Security Initiative, were able to bring down that number of homicides to 7. And then sporting activities came in, the same thing we're talking about, homework activities, summer camps, residential retreats, where key operatives were sort of reoriented and given and taken into alternative livelihood. Next. And it didn't just stop there, because what we were looking for was this going to just be a rebound phenomenon? And what we have seen with this community and with many other where we've been able to implement it systematically is that there is sustained results. And what you see is the community development committees coming and taking over the leadership of the community. The communities actually own the peace and they build the partnerships. And you keep violence interruption work going. And external support is brought in to make sure the gains are maintained. Next. And we save money. And we definitely looked at what the cost was, even with the infrastructure cost. We still came out slightly ahead. Next. Next.
Nice. Violence wasn't for me.
That's when PMI fully introduced the sector to me.
I love working with PMI. PMI changed life.
For the era that the PMI is here, there is not one shooting or killing in this community. I tell myself that if I can save even one youth, I feel that I achieve something. As I say, the solution to violence is community development. You know. If the community develop and the youth them start have something to do, you have less islands, you have less island, you have less criminal.
What I do for PMI is getting youngsters involved in activities and drama and sports. The studio and the football team help to control the violence.
Being Jamaican means independent, means strong, means powerful. My dream for the community is peace, unity and love.
One of the important things for this to be sustained at a community level is the efficient working of the police and efficient investigative. And using the data that we have, we can use it to guide the police and to help measure the impact of effective policing. Next. We also are using the hospital data because how I got into this, we see over 25,000 cases of violence-related injuries in our hospitals across the island. But what we use that data for is to identify communities that are affected. We give it to all the public sector agencies, and they can intervene, reduce retaliation, and target communities for intervention. Next. And this is a result from using it at KPH over a period of 5 years. And we actually saw at KPH, our major trauma hospital, a 45% reduction in gunshot wounds that were treated at the hospital, which also resulted in significant savings. Next. We have to back this information and activities up with effective education campaigns. And they need to be well tested, they need to be well designed, and they need to be coordinated and sustained. We recently have, because of some of the work that, effective work that has been done, become a pathfinder country to end violence against children. We want to congratulate the Prime Minister for coming out publicly to say that we are going to make a difference and we're going to end violence against our children. And this will be one of the fundamental moves to reducing violence and, as he said, achieving our sustainable development goals. Next. The other important thing is that we have to have our school-based interventions, and we need therapeutic interventions for the young people that are starting to give trouble in school so that we can increase school attendance and decrease expulsion and dropouts. This is where the gangs that Prof was talking about are started. If we can keep them effectively in schools through our therapeutic interventions, we make a significant difference. Next. The other thing is alternative livelihoods. How do we dry up what they call the soldiers, the guy who working for the top dog in the community? We have to find something that needs to be done for unemployed, idle youth who often are not functionally literate. Next. And one of the things that the government has done, and we have to put our energy behind it, is putting in the Project Hope, housing opportunity, production, and employment. And how we're going to provide education and job opportunities for those young people between 19 and 24 years. Over 15,000 are to be targeted. Next. The other thing we have to continue to, and we heard about this, the importance of resilience. Communities, even those are not really affected, have to be resilient. And how do we build that resilience community-wise and increase the community cohesion to prevent the violence from eroding the structures? Next. And all of this has to be underpinned by research. And we need to ensure that there is operational research, that funding to go on. And as we roll out the programs, as we do our zones of special operations and our social interventions, we have to be collecting the data, using it, analyzing it, and ensuring we're on the right track and have the buy-in. And the last thing is that what we've seen from our cost of care study, which will be released shortly, that we are spending 3.6 billion Jamaican dollars on looking after those 25,000 violence-related injuries in our hospital. When we look at the annual cost of the interventions, we could be doing and implementing most of this with $1.3 billion. Can we make the investment? Next. Next. Okay. Well, the real thing that I was going to bring up was 3 points. Is, do we really believe and are we willing to invest our money in violence prevention? The second thing is, are we going to create the fiscal space to do the work that needs to be done without interruption? Because every year at the end of our fiscal budget, all the social programs are under great constraint and usually have to slow down for a few months. and violence doesn't slow down? And are we going to be willing to do the coordinated work that we heard about this morning as we grow the economy to ensure that this work is sustained and it's managed in an effective way for our young people, for our children, and for our future growth?
Those are fascinating presentations. We're going to dive a little bit into that, and also obviously, yes. Hello, is this on now? No. We switch on this mic, or are we going to talk into these mics? Hello. Is this one on? Is it on now? Yes, there. Eureka. Fantastic. So I want to dive into some of these presentations and also draw out some of the wider Caribbean perspectives. Wheeler over there. Just Professor Clayton, start with you. I'd like to hear your thoughts on to what extent youth unemployment are linked, and also one of the things that came up. Yes, wait until I'll just hand this to you. It's probably easier. Links between crime and corruption. Obviously, it's something that you touched upon in your presentation, but I think the interlinks between the economic and violent crime aspects are interesting to explore.
Okay, youth unemployment first. We've got a large reservoir of youth who've left school with very poor qualifications or very poor qualifications. It's very hard to employ them in the formal economy. So partly this is a result of a failing in our educational system. But then once you have this pool, it means you have a potential source of gang recruits, and also potentially for people who are susceptible to fundamentalist ideology. And we're starting to pick up traces now of fundamentalist jihadist organizations with a presence now in the Caribbean, which is very alarming because they have a message which has a great deal of resonance for disaffected youth. We haven't done as well as we should. We haven't really done very well in terms of trying to address this. We have various social interventions. We have training schemes and so forth. These have been not necessarily very effective because the problem is still it has not fundamentally diminished. I think it's partly because a lot of people go through the same training programs and they're still graduating into unemployment. So one of the things that we have to do is think about how we can create economic opportunities in some of the disadvantaged areas. Now this is more challenging because it's not just about creating job opportunities, there are also deep-rooted cultural issues now. There's a lot of youth who are simply not interested in doing the kind of jobs that we can offer because they think they can make a bit more money in less time scamming or with a contract killing. So we have to actually try and find ways to make the legitimate alternatives more attractive, but at the same time we have to try and close off those other short-track routes to wealth and power. Fundamentally, it really does come down to a long-running process of cultural re-engineering, because we have to start with young children, and we have to start fixing the schools so that we can actually start to change this project. It will take a generation. With regard to the issues with corruption, this happens at several levels. One is any government which has issues with corruption is a serious issue with its loss of moral integrity and leadership. It sets a very bad example to people because they see that we live in a world in which you just do whatever you have to do to get by. I think it's very important for people in public life to have high levels of personal integrity. But the other thing is, this is more even more fundamental, is that there is almost impossible for organized crime to operate in the country without people on the side track who are providing cover and money laundering services. If you look at the Mexican drug cartels or the Italian mafia, they need corrupt attorneys, corrupt bankers, corrupt business people, corrupt politicians. It does not have to be a very large number of corrupt people, but they provide indispensable services for organized crime. You have to have a way to get their money back into the formal system. You have to have a bank that will accept it. You have to have a way to launder cash back through the system because you're involved in activities that generate large volumes of cash which you cannot otherwise explain. So you have to have business activities which look legitimate but are actually a way of getting money back into the formal economy. There are gatekeepers. There are people who can control that process and who are not doing so because in some cases it's enormously lucrative for them not to do so. If we can close down those money laundering routes, we will start to starve organized crime of the resources it needs to operate. But corruption operates at a low level as well, because we've got problems at low levels. If you look, for example, at one of the, how it's possible for people to get things like fake passports in this country, well, it turns out that there's a back office government department, Registrar General's department, and if you just have one low-level clerk there who's willing to pass you the right piece of paper, you can get a bogus birth certificate and then you can get a fake passport. So it may turn out that your vulnerability is some low-level clerk who is not obviously in a high-risk position. So we need to look at all the government machinery. We need to think about how we can move as much of this online as possible so that we can have stronger government systems with, and then build in an emphasis on integrity, and there's ways that we can do that in the public service. Robin, thank you.
Ms. Wheeler, I want to draw in some of the wider Caribbean perspectives here. I'd like to hear, how you feel crime and violence differs in the Caribbean compared to maybe other parts of the world, how your experiences are in Trinidad. I only spent a few days there, so it's something I only know loosely, but I know you also have a big issue with it despite being materially wealthier than some of your neighboring countries.
Okay, well, good morning to Honorable Excellencies, the Prime Ministers, Ms. Lagarde. I really am going to shift the focus because we heard a lot of statistics this morning, and it's wonderful to have statistics, but I'm a practitioner, I'm a technocrat, right? The area that I work in specifically is in human trafficking, but I also do some research in other areas. And for me, it's all about what would actually work on the ground. And while we got a very strong Jamaican perspective in the last two presentations, I'm going to take it to the other islands of the Caribbean and look at some of the challenges that face the other islands. The Honorable Prime Minister mentioned organized crime, smuggling of weapons, international narcotics as some of the challenges facing Jamaica. When we look at the other countries in the region, there are other types of crimes. Human trafficking exists in the region as in other parts of the world, and it has actually become very predominant in the media and in, just in different spheres. In the Caribbean, you would have seen between the year 2000 and 2010, many of the countries would have signed and ratified the UN protocol against transnational organized crime. And as a result of that, many countries would have enacted domestic legislation. So what I want to say is human trafficking is also transnational organized crime, right? It's not just drugs, it's not just the guns, but it's also people. And one of the things that the government of Trinidad and Tobago is focusing on is putting people first. So while it's important to have the statistics and the numbers and the theoretical models to address crime, we need to consider the people, right? The people, the victims of crime. And I have yet to see how much does it cost a country to restore, repatriate, and reintegrate a victim of crime. I haven't seen those costs as yet. We've seen costs for everything else. And it is, besides the social cost, it is a cost on the state. And when we're looking at the issue of trafficking in persons, trafficking in arms, what we would say is that the same routes that have been used to traffic illegal weapons and also drugs, they have now graduated to traffic in persons. It's more profitable, and we know we have a room full of academics. We know about the statistics. They say it's 40 billion slaves now in the world. They say it's over $150 billion profit. It is actually more profitable than trafficking illegal weapons and illegal guns. You throw some people into the boats, and there you have additional funds. The last I saw in the media was in Libya, where they were selling persons for $400, I think. It was CNN that raised that and brought it to the attention of the world. So people trafficking and selling people as slaves is still very much alive. When we look at countries, the Caribbean islands generally, we are island states mainly. We are not landlocked, and as a result, we have the challenges of having to manage our borders and manage entry points around the islands. Many of us are challenged with those resources, the physical resources and the manpower resources, to be able to man our borders. With respect to Trinidad, as you know, we are the island that's right next to the South American mainland. So what you find happening is when the larger organizations come in with their anti-drug trafficking strategies, and the strategy is focused, let's say, on Central America, the traffickers simply shift to the Caribbean. When the strategies are focused on the Caribbean, they shift back to Central America. And we've seen that happen over the past few years when there was a CBSI, that's a Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, and then it stopped for a while. And then recently we saw that there is an investment now in the CBSI, and so you're going to see traffickers again shift their routes. At the end of the day, it is all about money. It's all about money, right? And it's all about profit. And one of the ways that we can hit the criminal networks is by hitting their money. That's where it hurts them the most. People are driven to do crime for various reasons, but mainly the main reason is all about money. Right? And one of the strategies we can look at is, we heard about multi-pronged, multi-dimensional approach. It's a parallel strategy of looking at the financial crimes while at the same time looking at the actual criminal offense. We call them parallel investigations. And so we tackle the money laundering, we tackle the other types of crimes. There are other types of financial crimes that occur on the internet. We know about the dark net, and the other areas where they transact coins, the bitcoins and stuff. So it's not just actual banking transactions. You find that criminal networks have now graduated to finding other ways to transport cash back to their homeland. And so even with Trinidad and Tobago, you find that Panama is a route that is used by traffickers, not just the human traffickers, but also other types of smugglers to transit their funds. I will give you a practical example. Again, I said I'm the practical person. There's a Facebook page that was set up by persons in the Latin American community, and if they wanted to send money back to any of the Latin American countries, they will actually physically give them Trinidad and Tobago dollars in their hand, and those persons are able to now take that cash and transit it through Panama back to their homeland. I can't figure out the logistics of it. I'm not a financial person, so maybe the experts in the room can figure out how they actually get that done by simply setting up a Facebook page and having that as the communication platform. And it is a way outside of the banking sector to get money back to persons at home. So one of the other things I wanted to add in terms of strategy is really about the 4 Ps, which is a strategy used in human trafficking: prevention, protection, prosecution, and partnerships. Partnerships is key. Partnership with the churches, the faith-based organizations. The Caribbean community, we all know about going to Sunday school. When parents forced us to go on a Sunday, we had to go to church every Sunday. And if those values can be restored in our community, these are spiritual values and moral values that can be restored, then that's the basis of where we start to address the issue of crime. We're talking about youth unemployment, right? And young people need direction. Young people, they need someone that they can look up to. They need a mentor. And what has happened is many of the criminals and the dons, if you want to say, have become the mentors of these young persons, because there is the absence of a mother, a father, an adult, or any person that can really give them that guidance. So it's important to restore the spiritual and the moral values in our young people. It's important for us to partner with non-governmental organizations, faith-based organizations, civil society organizations, and also other government and international institutions. In Trinidad, we have partnered very closely with the UN agencies, particularly the International Organization for Migration, UNDP, and other UN agencies. The government has been working very closely to try to address the developmental issues and the challenges. So what I wanted to put out there to you is, let's put aside the mathematics and the statistics, and let's focus on people. It's all about people. In human trafficking, the response is it's a victim-centered approach. How can we help the victims of crime? How can we help our citizens not fall prey to crime or become criminals themselves?
Thank you very much for that. I mean, I think we all have heard the Porfirio Diaz quote about Mexico being so unfortunate, being so far from God, but so close to the United States. I once went to the Dominican Republic, and a former government official said he wished that they could only grow cocaine in the Rocky Mountains instead. But with that, I want to turn to you, Richard, and bring in some international perspective, especially some of your thoughts on what we've heard so far, but also what you learned in New York, because obviously New York is a huge success story when it comes to actually reducing crime.
Is that working? That's working. Okay, so good morning all. Madame Lagarde, Prime Minister, thank you so much for doing this. Certainly thank you for inviting me. And I must say I'm really quite impressed that what is in essence an economic conference starts with a panel on crime. And I think there is an implicit recognition in that fact, so we're not going to have to persuade you that one of the biggest obstacles to growth, to economic growth, is rampant crime. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, having worked extensively in New York when New York was on the brink of absolutely disappearing as a city, financial ruin, bankruptcy, a police department that was vastly underfunded and understaffed, and crime that was so bad that any of these maps that you were looking at before would have had New York as one of the most violent cities in the world. We have had enormous success, and we are now one of the safest cities in the world. And I can tell you that one of the most immediate impacts of the rapid declines in crime that we achieved, and we can walk through how we did that, was the economy just soared. From the financial sector to tourism to the real estate sector, both commercial and residential, and to all the ancillary businesses that involves. The economy just took off and has remained quite resilient ever since. We see a direct correlation between decreasing crime and increasing economic growth. And as we say in law, I'm a lawyer by training, that's probably a proposition too plain to be disputed. I think that's irrefutable. I do want to talk about some of the data we heard today, and yes, data is important, but I associate myself with the remarks that deciding what we do about the data is the most important thing we can discuss. And since we are at an economic conference, I'll go from the macro to the micro and try and pull together a lot of what's been said here today and give you some thoughts from an international perspective. I'm very fortunate in that I do get to work around the world on these issues, literally from Oman and parts of India to the United Kingdom to extensively throughout the United States, and now almost all of my work, well, actually 99% of my work now is in the Latin American countries, Central America, and to some growing extent in the Caribbean. And with that work, I am completely aware of the fact that all crime is local, that every culture is different, every sensitivity is different, economic pressures are different, criminal pressures are different. I completely understand that. But I say to you most respectfully that we cannot allow that to become a shield by which we hide behind a lot of the successes that have taken place out there. Because as much as crime is local, there are also now developing universal principles around how to fight crime. I was speaking with someone last night at the reception, and I'm saying it's very interesting, something's happening in the crime fighting world that I never expected to happen, which is we're almost beginning to be able to model ourselves around the wonderful organization called Doctors Without Borders. Doctors Without Borders succeeds because a human body essentially is a human body, whether you're in Africa or you're in New York. It's the same physiology. The same is becoming apparently true about crime. The methodologies to analyze the causes of and the prescriptions to fight it are more and more and more evident. So while crime may be local, the prescriptions are not. And that leads me to really the second point, which I think has been made in different ways today, and in some ways is one of the most important points. I give what's now become a stock speech, because I've given it so many times. around this question, which I frame as, who owns the crime issue? Who owns the crime issue? And the answer you've heard from this panel today, and the answer which I think is absolutely right, is that we all do. And what do I mean by that? I go to so many events which are around, these summits that we have around crime, and you get the police there. And you get all the police there. You get the hierarchy of the police, the local police officers, the community police officers, police, police, police. And that's great. Police are the forefront. They are the way you get your fastest reductions in crime. They are critical to bringing crime down. Nothing, nothing, nothing beats anything else to fight crime like a well-run, well-managed, effective police force. But it's not enough. And it's not enough because crime is not just a criminal justice issue. Crime is also a public health issue. So when I say we all own the crime problem, that means we urge governments, when they have crime summits, to make sure your housing people are there, your education people are there, your finance people are there, your public health people are there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason for that is that so many of the drivers of crime, so many of the drivers of gang behavior, for instance, which drives crime around the world, are deeply seated in public health aspects. The role of grief and trauma is a absolutely I won't say misunderstood, but little understood aspect of what drives gang behavior, yet it gets almost no attention in the criminal discussions. So when we think at the macro level, we must think about public health. Dr. Ward is spot on right about the ability to use designated interventions in high crime neighborhoods to very effectively bring crime down. There's now extensive experience around that in the United States, and it's working extremely well, and I know her program well. I've been in Jamaica before and heard her give this presentation, and the work she does is really remarkably efficient. The other piece of this that I want to highlight, Robin, is, if I may, Prime Minister, associate myself with a remark that you made. In your remarks about stimulating economic growth, you talked about the criticality of government developing partnerships with the private sector. I suggest that when it comes to crime, that is a two-way street. That the private sector has a role to play, a very effective role to play in this fight against crime. And it's not just putting money into it. And I could walk through, if we have time, numerous things that the private sector can do to bring crime down in various jurisdictions. And when I'm asked to help set up these sorts of events, I insist that the business sector be at the table and that we ask the business sector hard questions about what they're willing to do to help bring down crime, because they become one of the principal beneficiaries of a much safer society. And that obviously is incredibly important. We also tend to talk, and it's happened here, I think 3, if not 4 times, we tend to talk about the economic impact of crime. And that's important because governments have to think in economic terms. There's no question about that. Governments stand stronger politically when they can make economically based arguments to their citizenry about why they're doing what and what they're achieving. But let's not also forget, as you were saying, about the other, so the more almost hidden costs of crime. And think about what crime does to well-ordered societies. Think about how crime can so sharply erode any sense of government legitimacy and how critical government legitimacy is to a well-ordered society. Think about what crime does to the rule of law, how we lose all respect for the rule of law, and show me a successful, free society anywhere in the world that is not based on the rule of law. It simply doesn't exist. It is fundamental to the functioning of any democracy. The sense of impunity goes up and up and up, impunity being the economic, behavioral decision that criminals make when they commit crimes. Simply, will I get caught? And the answer far too often is no. And if I get caught, what will happen to me? And the answer far too often is probably nothing. So that's a big problem, because as impunity rises, so does the level of criminality. But we know how to bring impunity down. We're doing a very interesting project in Colombia using big data to analyze how we bring impunity down. And of course, it absolutely destroys social cohesion. It rips apart neighborhoods in ways that almost nothing else can. So those are all some of the macro issues. And the one final macro issue, and then I'll go to the micro, Robin, is far too often when I go to these conferences, and respectfully, I think it's true today, you almost never see the prosecutors and the courts at the table. You have the police at the table, but you don't see the prosecutors and the courts. Criminal justice is a three-legged stool. Police, 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 you have to have it, but if you don't have effective prosecution, I'm a former prosecutor, if you don't have effective prosecution and a sharp, constructive relationship between your prosecutors and your police, you cannot bring the kinds of cases that you need to bring to your courts. And if your courts aren't functioning, you have a very serious problem, because they are the bedrock of this. If there's one thing I say with great pride, is that the courts in the United States tend to function extremely well, and that's because they're under constant scrutiny. They're an independent branch of government, but we are not beyond criticizing judges when they do things that even speak of corruption. And we prosecutors react very, very, very vigorously if that were to happen. So where does this operationalize itself in the micro? I'm not going to spend a lot of time, because we don't have it, talking about the myriad of techniques that now exist out there to bring about sharp reductions in crime. But there is a couple of things that I want to highlight, and I want to highlight them because they are ironically much less costly than some of the traditional approaches to crime, and they are far more effective. And they embrace a notion of certainly of physics, and I think of economy, and something which is becoming increasingly apparent in the fight against crime. And that is the operationalization of the 80-20 rule. The 80-20 rule, which essentially says that 80% of all phenomena are caused by 20% of actions or actors. We are now completely convinced that that occurs in the crime-fighting space. Very often, when we arrest and prosecute someone for 2 or 3 robberies, we now know that that person actually has committed 20 or 30 robberies. So we've now adopted something, and I'm working in Argentina and Uruguay to do some of this, something we call precision policing. Precision policing rejects this notion that you have to, quote, flood the zone, that is, put thousands of cops into high crime neighborhoods in inattentive, untrained ways who end up harassing the population. Precision policing uses advanced data analytics to understand who the principal drivers of crime are in those neighborhoods, and targets in a good way those people first for public health interventions. We have something we call cure violence. It's just another way of talking about what Dr. Ward talks about, which is we go and we literally knock on the door. We knock on the door and we say, Billy, we know you're out there. We know what your criminal record is. We want to tell you that if you get arrested again, here's the sentence you're looking at. You've got their attention at this point. But I'm here with whomever, your local clergyman, your local teacher, your local coach, your local mentor. We're here to help you with whatever it is that ails you. But we tell you that if you go out there and commit a crime, we are going to respond, and we're going to respond with vigor. And we do. And very often, these people get the message, because you're going in with a very personalized approach. They realize they are now on the radar screen of law enforcement. And very often, they will accept the interventions that we're offering. But in order to keep these programs credible, if they do violate, we do come down on them, and we do make sure the law responds, the law meaning the prosecutors and the courts. We also apply the 80-20 rule, and I know this is a problem in Jamaica, to the instrumentalities of crime. That is, in US context, and I know here too, guns, illegal guns. We have a terrible problem with illegal guns. I spent 10 years of my life helping to build and then lead the national movement in the United States to control illegal guns. It is a terrible problem. But we now focus, to use President Clinton's old term, like a laser beam on illegal guns, and it's having a huge impact. So we're going after the principal purveyors of violence and the principal instrumentality that they use, and it's working quite well. And then we use all the other tools that have been talked about today. We have a big focus in getting high risk, that is, kids who are involved in gangs, into jobs. And I don't mean sort of cheap jobs, if you will, street cleaning jobs. I mean jobs with long-term careers. And we do that because we think it's fundamental to fighting gang violence to replace the despair that a lot of these kids feel with the hope that they can have a future. You talk with enough gang kids and you ask them how long they expect to live, and if they say 30, that's a statement of optimism. Think about if your expected lifespan is 30 years old. How does that frame your thoughts around school, around work, around family, etc.? We try and replace that with a much longer term vision. And then, and I'll close with this because there are so many things you could talk about that. In the organization that I run in the United States, we have started an innovation lab to take the most cutting edge technology, which we understand, and bring it into the crime prevention space. And that effort, I will tell you, we're now about a year into it, has gone extraordinarily well. We are already developing products that we have rolled out into the crime fighting space that we have now, through evaluations external to us, proven work. And if at some point you want to talk about that, I'm happy to do it. It's worked so well that Microsoft, Oracle, IBM, Carnegie Mellon, and MIT have all developed partnerships with us. So this is a great space for both economic investment and economic investment that would have a direct impact on your criminality in your jurisdiction. You could stimulate your growth sector in the high-tech space, clearly one of the great growth areas of the future, and bring some very cutting-edge, very interesting technology to this fight against crime. So I'll close with this thought that I started with. Who owns the crime issue? We all do. We all do. And when everybody puts their shoulder into the wind, you will be stunned at the results you get, some of which you'll get very, very quickly. The UPPs in Rio, and I was actually had the good fortune to be quite involved with that, were just one sign of the success that can be achieved when there is sustained, sharp, comprehensive government focus. It can be done almost anywhere, and I just encourage you, don't get depressed by all the numbers, because they can be depressing. Become optimistic by what's happening out there and understand we really can succeed against this fight. Thank you very much.
Right, so I think we're going to draw it to an end there, unfortunately, just to get the conference a little bit back on schedule. But obviously, if you have any questions, then please approach these people, not me, because I don't know anything about this. But there were so many questions I didn't get a chance to ask, so I'll be hammering you about them afterwards. But thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. In the interest of time, we'd just like to announce that there is coffee break outside. However, we are running about 20 minutes behind our schedule. And so may I invite those who are involved in session 2. And session 2 will focus primarily on fiscal policy and political cycles. The moderator is Mr. Oliver Clark, the chairman of the Gleaner Group. May I ask that you go toward the stage? We'll come to my cue. In the meantime, may I ask all the stage handlers as well to just put the chairs back onto the stage. We have no more PowerPoint presentations. And so we also ask the Honorable Dr. Barrett Jagdale, the former president of Guyana, to make his way to the front of the stage, along with the Honorable Bruce Golding, former Prime Minister of Jamaica, Mr. Richard Biles, the chairman of the Sagicor Group, and Andrea Repetto, president of the Chile Fiscal Advisory Council. So we'd like to turn this around in about 3 minutes. During that 3 minutes, you may go get coffee break and come right back while we get the second session prepared. So those involved in the second session, could you make your way to the stage, and we'll be able to provide the microphone. And for the stage handlers, could you replace the chairs onto the stage? Thank you.
Thank you for joining PBCJ Jamaica's coverage of the 27th Jamaica Pegasus Hotel in New Kingston under the theme Unleashing Growth and Resilience in the Caribbean. There are over 300 participants expected for this forum. Now, the first session has just concluded and they are now making preparations for the second session, which is expected to focus on fiscal policy and political cycles. So in essence, ensuring continuity as it pertains to fiscal policies in spite of electoral changes. But let's go back to the first session, which just concluded. That session focused on the topic, the Caribbean Growth Challenge, crime and youth unemployment, and how to break that cycle. Now, let me just bring up quickly some of the main points raised by some of the presenters. Now, one of the presenters during the crime forum or the crime panel is Miss Alana Wheeler. She is the Deputy Director of the Counter Human Trafficking Unit in Trinidad and Tobago. And let me just give you a quick summary of some of the points that she raised. She highlighted that human trafficking is also a form of transnational organized crime, to show you how complex something which may seem as simple as human trafficking, moving people from one border to another for the purposes of illegal activities, is. She says that human trafficking is far more profitable, get this, far more profitable than trafficking in drugs and guns. So in essence, modern slavery is big business. And in our case in Jamaica here, we don't know if that is the case, but oftentimes a lot of the young people go missing and some of them unfortunately aren't found. So now, another point made by Ms. Wheeler was about the approach that's taken to cracking down on trafficking in one form or another. She says when these campaigns are launched, what happens is that it displaces the players. So be it human trafficking, drug trafficking, guns trafficking in Central America or in the Caribbean. Once the players in Central America are targeted, they shift to the Caribbean where there is less heat and vice versa. So she wants a more concerted effort or emphasis to be placed on, examining the approach in that area. She also pointed out that in their search for mentors, because of the lack of role models in the home, be it parents or in the community or wherever the need is, young people in particular, because remember the focus of session 1 was on how the lack of growth impacts crime and youth unemployment, or impacts youth unemployment, which in turn results in the spiraling of crime, especially among young people. So she says when young people go in search of mentors which they don't have at home, then they end up in the arms of criminals. Now let me just give you a quick rundown of one of the other panelists, Mr. Richard Aborn. He is the president of the Citizens Crime Commission of New York City. Now he raised some interesting points. He pointed out that crime is everyone's business, which we all know, but the question is, how do you go about getting that buy-in? He said that crime is more than just the police force's business. It's also a public health issue, and that's a recurrent theme that we've been hearing here back home in Jamaica. Mr. Aborn also spoke about this 80-20 rule, where he says 80% of all phenomena are caused by 20% of actors or actions. And as we all know, crime isn't an event or criminals who usually are responsible for the crime rate in any given area are usually a small clique, and the majority end up suffering for the few. But let's return you to the platform where they are about to resume their activities by going to the second session focusing on fiscal policy and political cycles.
You would say that at the current time. But the potential is there.
No man, no, don't start, because they wouldn't listen to you. Nobody is here. You gotta wait until you got somebody to listen to. You never been together? Yeah, it's a rough period.
Winning and setting a world record is the greatest thing in the world. And you wouldn't believe how tough it is every day getting prepared for a race. Some days it's so hard, I just want to stop. But there's no shortcuts. To be the best, you have to work hard, train hard, all natural. That's the Jamaican way. I'm Usain Bolt, and I don't need dope to cope.
A message from the Jamaica Anti-Doping Commission and the Ministry of Youth, Sports and Culture.
We had a perfect love story, but everything changed. We start getting angry for the simplest things. I knew it wasn't healthy, but I loved him. It's only when I ended up in the hospital I realized that I had to make a choice. Him or me. I chose me. I called the police and they helped me.
If you're a victim of domestic abuse, get help. Call your nearest police station. A message from the Ministry of National Security.
When we the people speak out, changes happen.
True thing. I remember how we women speak out hard to get maternity leave.
Our voices and letters supported the formation of Indigo.
To deal with the protection of citizens.
Vex and we'll speak up loud about the Riverton fire. And them have to change the leadership.
People, we need to speak out more. When we speak out, every government have to listen.
that in a recent survey done by the OCA in schools across Jamaica, 43% of the students received inappropriate messages from strangers. The OCA wants you to be smart online. Never speak to persons you don't know. Parents, encourage your children to be social but be smart.
This message was brought to you by the Office of the Children's Advocate with support from UNICEF.
Years, the world economy has grown 8 times faster than Jamaica has. So I think that if we want to close this gap, we have to be really tough and efficient on every issue. One of the issues that I want to touch on is what I call making suboptimal decisions. And what do I mean by that? These are decisions that are made within the framework of the fiscal rule, which is a piece of legislation that we adopted, I think just prior to the first IMF agreement, and which is a tremendous piece of legislation. I think many of you here are familiar with it. But within that piece of legislation, there is room to do stuff that is not optimal, and I think that that is something we need to address. And my remarks are really around addressing that issue of suboptimal decisions. And I'll touch on one which I hope the Prime Minister will forgive me for, but I feel that I have, which is a tax break that was given that cost us somewhere in the region of about 240 million US. Now, it was done responsibly in the sense that it fitted within the fiscal rule. But I asked myself the question, can Jamaica afford to spend 240 million US on that issue rather than on something else? Was that an optimal decision? And so that leads me to remarks I want to make about the fiscal rule and the way in which we administer it. Prime Minister also spoke about building partnerships, and I think this is an area that clearly we can build a partnership going forward. A partnership that is inclusive and one that is agreement is going to come to a completion, and I know successfully so, in about 2 years' time. At that point, they give up, so to speak, their audit role, and we have to take 100% responsibility for what we do and how we do it, and that what we do is in the best interest all the time and is always optimal. So I am proposing that the experience with EPOC can help to serve us in respect of this issue of optimal decisions. The Auditor General, who is in charge of administering, so to speak, the fiscal rule, she or he is the one that does the investigation and comes to Parliament and speaks about it. I'd like to see that role be played within the embrace of a citizens committee. And that committee would have oversight to see that the fiscal responsibility process, that is how the budget is comprised, how it is funded, is done in a most effective way. I think the members should represent business, labor, key civil society groups. They should be appointed without any government approval. They should have access to the same information as the Auditor General, and they should have the right and the responsibility to express an opinion publicly on any matter that affects their mandate. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Next on the front is Bruce Golding. Bruce Golding was a former 8th Prime Minister of Jamaica and is one of the few people that has been a member of 2 parties over his life, you know.
You're using up a lot of valuable time.
Right, go ahead then.
You know, democracy, by definition, is competitive, indeed combative. And the main weapons that are used in that combat the promises and the manifesto pledges, which are designed to attract voter support, invariably have fiscal consequences, so that there is an inherent friction between the election process and the fiscal dynamics. And that is even more so in countries like ours, where you have high levels of unemployment, high levels of poverty, where you have such a high level of dependence on government services. Jamaica has sought to break that cycle, because it's a cycle. Governments come into office, they either face the realities where they can't deliver on these promises, which leads to them becoming unpopular, or in trying to deliver on those promises, they make the situation worse, and they become unpopular, and the cycle starts all over again, what Professor Sidney Tower coined the cycle of contention. We have sought to break that cycle, and we have done well, even though the targets that we had put into the fiscal responsibility framework have had to be pushed back a couple of years. But I think that we can take pride in what has been achieved so far. And let us look at what led to that. No question at all. The fact that it was a requirement of the IMF program played a huge part. But I think we need to recognize as well the strength of political leadership on both sides of the aisle that made that possible. I think we were fortunate as well in that in Jamaica we no longer, we did a couple of decades ago, we no longer have any serious ideological division between the major political parties. I think the oversight role that was given to EPOC, so very well co-chaired by Richard, I think they did a tremendous job in terms of giving the program credibility. And I'm very pleased to see that EPOC has now gone on the road to try to engage the ordinary citizens and to get them to buy in to the program. Now, there are a couple of things I want to say, but because I gather Oliver wants us to spend as much time in conversation as possible. But a couple of things I want to say. One, the effectiveness of the fiscal rules. And fiscal rules have become quite widespread. Last count I did, I think 96 countries have some form of fiscal rule. And this became quite prevalent, particularly since the financial crisis of about 10 years ago. But they vary in terms of how they're formulated and how they're applied. Vary in terms of rule coverage. In our case, we are covering fiscal balance, we're covering debt, we're covering wage to GDP ratio, which speaks to the question of the size of government. It depends as well on rule firmness. Now, many countries have enacted statutes, and we have done so. Some countries rely only on political commitment. There are 10 countries, interestingly, that have actually embedded fiscal rules in their constitution, and that's something that I will want to speak on when we get into the conversation. A lot has to do as well with the enforceability, the enforcement arrangements of the rules, because that can determine whether the rule that it is not something that is abused and taken advantage of. You're going to give me a second bite of the cherry, I'm sure.
Now we'd like to ask President Jagdeo. President Jagdeo was one of the youngest heads of state in the world at 35. He somewhat unusually passed a law limiting the term of office in Ghana. And then that law kicked you out, didn't it? So, over to you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I think from the briefs that we received as panelists, I think we're being asked to conclude that fiscal politics is harmful to our macroeconomic situation. And I think that universally this is true, and it's true in the Caribbean too. And it's true that we have historically and even now continue in many of our countries to live above our means. And because we live above our means, there are consequences to that. And it's true that we do make unsustainable promises at elections time that will come back to haunt us and affect us. But are these the biggest concerns of our region? Are the promises that we make around election time and the fulfillment of our promises affecting our growth model most? So I don't want to come back to that question in a moment. But when we look, I had a quick look at some statistics around the world, and as a share of GDP, our wage bill is lower than that of the developed world as a share of GDP. It is true that our wage bill is higher than that of the developed world when compared with total expenditure or revenue as a percentage of revenue, but it's low when compared to GDP. And so it's important that we go through all the countries of the Caribbean and statistically examine whether it is the wage bill or fiscal profligacy that is the biggest challenge to our growth model. And this brings me to the conference theme, Unleashing Growth and something about resilience, strengthening resilience. So are the topics before us here the three things we are discussing: crime, fiscal politics, and the balance between stability and the risk in our financial system? Are these the three biggest challenges to growth and sustainability in the region? And in my view, they're not. They're not. The challenges, so I acknowledge right at the beginning that these issues can contribute to an unsustainable model, etc. So let's go back to what the managing director of the IMF said in her presentation. She said, I'm a bit puzzled about why we have lagging growth in spite, I'm just paraphrasing, in spite of the fact that this region has pursued in many countries sustainable policies, but sustainable macroeconomic policies. And that curiosity should bother us. If it bothers the head of the IMF, then it should be the starting point for many of us too. Why is it so? And I believe it is so largely because the model is not appropriate for the region. The model pursued by, and that we followed almost slavishly, our policymakers, including me, I'm including myself, that model, the challenge is, if you look at 40 years, I looked at Norman Manley, and the same issues that he was dealing with, we're dealing back today with. And I want to contend, and maybe we'll talk a bit more about the components of the model that I believe that we can follow and that we have to advocate for, and that the IMF and others have to have a mindset to allow. I'll come back to that later. So maybe in the question and answer system. But I do acknowledge that the issues are relevant before us today that we're discussing, but they're not the biggest challenges to growth and resilience. Thank you.
Thank you. When you ask your questions, if you liked what somebody said, ask a question directly to him. Here are the rules again. One hand means you have a question dealing with whatever we're talking about. Two hands means you want to wander off into something else. Three hands means you're deformed. All right? Now, So the last session was damn rude to the people here, and I never took one question from the audience. So I'm looking for a lot of questions. Otherwise, this will be an equal failure. And at the back, I can't see you all, so get up if you want to ask questions. I do encourage you, because it's important. All right, now we have Andrea. Andrea is from Chile. She has a degree from MIT. She's an advising fellow at the World Bank, and you run something to control expenditure or do something. So tell us.
Thank you so much for the invitation to this conference, to the government of Jamaica and the IMF. Fiscal discipline is difficult. I guess our political leaders here know best than us who work from the technical perspective. The idea of having a fiscal rule is to place some durable constraints on fiscal discretion. You can set a limit to the growth of expenditures, to public debt, to the budget. And the idea is to face the tendency to push the burden of discipline to the future, not only to future governments, but also to future generations. And at the same time, it helps smoothing expenditures over time to avoid the possibility of spending a lot when things go well and then have to restrain expenditure when things don't go that well. Chile adopted a fiscal rule in 2001. Chile was an early adopter, and it has been one of the cornerstones of our healthy fiscal performance. Chile's net public debt is less than 5% of GDP right now. And it became law in 2006, and it's been working. This is work in progress, pretty much. The way it works is that a structural balance is targeted by each government. The structural balance is defined by the balance evaluated at potential GDP and at long-term cover prices. Cover prices are quite a challenge for fiscal policy in Chile because tax revenues, the part of tax revenues that come from copper fluctuates a lot. Right now it's less than 5%. 5 years ago it was over 20%. At the beginning of 2000 was 5% or so. So it fluctuates a lot, and then it makes it more difficult to finance in a permanent matter, in a permanent way, expenditures that you really need to do in a long-term, with a long-term view. So managing the volatility of corporate tax revenues is one of the most important challenges of fiscal policies in Chile. So that's one of the reasons why this rule was adopted. It insulates expenditure from all these fluctuations. It is very well known to the public, and it gives a lot of credibility. And part of the credibility has to do with independent advisors that have been working hand by hand with the rule. The Fiscal Council, I'm the president of the Fiscal Council in Chile, is quite new, it's from 2013. But the government who initiated this policy created, first of all, 2 independent panels of experts. One to forecast GDP, potential GDP and its long-term trend, and also long-term price covers. So these are 2 really crucial elements of the structural balance. We need to know what's coming up to the future in the long term to figure out how much would be the structural balance in each year. So we needed these 2 pieces of information, and they're not being forecasted from the very start by the government, but by 2 panels of experts that with the idea that any bias and any errors don't have to do with manipulation by the government, but they really have to do with forecasting errors that should cancel out over time. So the Fiscal Council came later. I'm going to quote Madame Lagarde. She said this morning, she quoted Jimmy Cliff's quote, "Rome wasn't built in a day." Our Fiscal Council and our fiscal rule has not been built in a day. It's a step-by-step process, and there's still work in progress, and I can tell you more a bit of what we've been doing and what we should push forward in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to cue questions, so start raising your hands if you have something to discuss. But as you know, there is basically a conflict between winning democratic elections and promise the electorate everything and prudent fiscal management. And what we're trying to do today is to talk about what mechanisms could be introduced into the Caribbean to try and ensure prudent fiscal management. I mean, if you look at the debt to GDP thing, I have the 2016 numbers. Jamaica leads the field, as it does in many other things, at 120%. Barbados is running a good, strong second at 105. Antigua is at 97. And what we're doing basically is using money now that future people will have to repay. And really the question we're trying to consider is there some other way of dealing with that? Certainly you can deal with it if you get rid of the democracy, because then you don't have to buy votes, but that's not a good plan. I see you put up your hand, Peter Blair. What is your question? So could I kind of see who might be interested, or are you all dull? Who's that? Right, one here. Anybody else? Well, good. I'm glad to see some of the big shots there are getting involved. Go ahead, Peter.
Well, I didn't actually put up my hand, but since you cold called me,
I saw you put it up. Don't contradict the chair.
So I guess my question to all the leaders is the following. We saw an example 25 years ago in Barbados where the government, Prime Minister Sandiford in particular, took extreme measures and put in place a big public sector wage cut that some would argue saved the country from crisis, but led to him being expelled, his party, from office for a decade plus. Is it fanciful to think that we can get that kind of leadership, or do we need rules to make that happen, or do we rely on just the luck of getting?
Direct the question at some unsuspecting.
Okay, President Jagdeo, start with you.
Leadership, I don't know, because politicians are the same everywhere. They would do what it takes to get elected. And I think most of them do believe, because when in opposition, they don't have all the facts that they can implement measures when they get into office to do better than the incumbent. And so I believe that the process of educating people who are in the opposition, well, who have been in opposition for a very long time, because those who are recently in opposition tend to be more aware of the situation. But education will probably temper some of the promises that are made. And if they make those promises in spite of the reality of the situation, promises that can be fulfilled, then they'd face the consequences at the next elections. And you're not going to change that with politicians around the world. So, but even saying that, I think, and we have to make good politics, like good climate issues, or good economics, one of the topics on which people talk about at election time. In most of our countries, we don't debate economics. It's left for the finance minister to make occasional statements around election time. People talk about streets and roads and jobs, etc. Never about the prevailing economic situation and the limitations. So that's important. And we have to put in place as many rules as possible that could condition good behavior, legislation, monitoring bodies, etc. So I acknowledge all of these things. But Oliver said something about a rule, 60% of GDP. You can agree to that for a country, but can, say, Jamaica really, even with all of that in place, achieve that alone? Or does it need international help? The reason I'm saying this is that in Guyana's case, based on our figures from our current foreign minister, who is a vice president, our debt to GDP ratio was over 900% in 1992. We were using, according to him, 153% of revenue to service debt. That's our starting point. When we left office, it was 50% of GDP, and we're using 4% of revenue now to service debt, down from 153. But did we do it all alone? The answer is no. Had we not been classified as a HIPIC, had we not advocated for and finally changed the prevailing mindset in the multilateral financial institutions, that if you give debt relief to countries, multilateral debt relief, it would create a moral hazard. And we worked on a campaign to change that. Jubilee 2000, meeting with the G7 in London, putting that issue of multilateral debt relief on the agenda of the IFIs, and then finally pushing for multilateral debt relief. Had we not done that, we would not have really achieved the success we had. So a combination, multilateral debt relief, paying back some money, and growing the economy that changed all the ratios. And so if Jamaica, 1 minute, Oliver, if Jamaica even does all the things in the world.
You're under no obligation to listen to the chairman of the
Okay, all right. Okay. But what if a hurricane, God forbids it, one hurricane wipes out 60% of GDP or 100% of GDP, and Jamaica has to now borrow to restart its economy? Then what happens? Those ratios go out of the window. And so, thank you.
You don't have to pay attention the first time, all right?
Okay.
Now, there's a very fine gentleman at the end here who wanted to ask a question. Could you say who you are?
Richard Gibson, Minister of Finance from St. Martin.
How is your country? You got a bad lick, didn't you?
Very bad lick, but we're bouncing back pretty good, we think.
Very good.
Mention was made of the debt to GDP ratio of Jamaica, Barbados, which was respectively 120 and 105. We have a debt to GDP ratio of 31.7%. Somehow it strikes me that debt to GDP ratio...
That was before the hurricane, but
that was before the hurricane, yeah.
You're going to have a bigger one after, aren't you?
Yes, we will. My point is that it strikes me that debt to GDP ratio does not influence economic growth, because notwithstanding our debt to GDP ratio of 31.7%, we still struggle with an anemic economic growth of 0.5%, 1%. So somehow it does not seem to be that the magic formula to growth is debt to GDP ratio as low as possible. Secondly, President Bagdadi...
Sorry, sir. What do you think it is then, if it's not the debt to GDP?
That's why I'm posing the question to you.
Who are you asking?
Yes. And President Bagdadi mentioned that the three...
You can't ask him all the questions. Ask somebody else up here some questions.
The three items, the three issues you identified, which you acknowledge to be important to be able to achieve growth and strengthen resilience, you think that those are not the only three items. Well, what are the other items we have to complement it to be able to achieve growth and strengthening resilience? Thank you.
Might I suggest, Oliver?
Yeah, I would very much like to hear your views.
I think we need to even broaden that postulation. Not just debt, fiscal deficit. I think we make a real serious mistake if we assume that fiscal consolidation, managed debt, macroeconomic stability, in and of themselves, by themselves, guarantee growth. Because there are a host of countries where we can demonstrate that that is not so. Which is not, I'm not in any way dismissing these critical fundamentals. But I think it's important. And I think the Prime Minister alluded to that, you know, stabilization, yes, but it has to be pro-growth. and it needs to be supported by policies that will stimulate growth. The difficulty we have is that some of the very policies that we have to pursue to achieve fiscal balance, to bring down the debt, are unfriendly to growth, are inimical to growth. And therefore we have to look at a number of other things, public-private partnership. We have to look at how we can, working within that framework, still find the impetus and still find the catalyst that will stimulate growth and get us on a sustainable path.
Thank you. There was a gentleman there, but when I look around, could people that have some questions put your hand up? Thank you. Anybody else? I mean, you're meant to be all, intelligent, and therefore it would be useful if you would participate in the discussion. And there's a bunch of diplomats over there. Some of your countries are run well, some badly, but why don't you tell us? So the queue is you and you. Who else wants to ask a question?
Mr. Clark, there are some questions in the back here as well.
Yeah, well, come out so we can see you. But I beg you, use your intelligence, because in 2 minutes, we're going to be over. And this is a very well-run panel, so that you have the opportunity, which you won't have during the rest of the day. Once Peter Blair starts talking, that's the end of you. All right.
Okay. Alejandro Werner from the IMF. Andrea, you mentioned two things. One is that Chile has a very low net debt to GDP ratio. I don't know if you mentioned also that, Chile is one of the highest growth rate countries in Latin America when we look at the last 2 decades. So in that sense, in this discussion of government expenditures and growth and what other policies can foster growth, it would be good to listen a little bit to what has Chile done to foster growth and be one of the fastest growing economies in Latin America. And the second question is, where you left us to, what's the role of the Fiscal Council in Chile?
Should I answer only one or both of them? No, to the first question, just what the fundamentals are. The fiscal rule doesn't work alone. It works hand in hand with an independent central bank that targets inflation, and also with exchange rate flexibility. So those are the three components of our sound policy, macro policies in Chile. The Fiscal Council, it's a permanent agency with a mandate to assess independently and publicly government policies, fiscal policies and plans, and how the rule performs, whether the rule is being fulfilled or not. The idea is to promote transparency, to promote fiscal responsibility for sure, but also to improve the quality of the public debate about fiscal policy. It matters a lot to the public in Chile, to the private sector, what are the plans of the government, and they're also very tied up to this rule. So there's a medium-term credibility about what's going on. Chile's fiscal rule, pretty much as what you described now, doesn't provide much guidance on practical issues. What do you do when a major shock comes? Can you break the rule? Can you switch the target? What happens when there are temporary small deviations from the rule? What should you do? What happens? We have a structural balance rule, as I told you, so what matters is the revenue in the long term. What do you do when there's a tax reform that changes taxes only temporarily? Do they come in the structural balance or not? That's what the Fiscal Council has been doing in Chile, partly giving credibility to the rule, looking after it, whether performance is being fulfilled, the rule has been fulfilled, but also advising the government on how to practically implement these rules, because you cannot write everything into law, and you will face challenges along the way, and that's what these advisory councils are for.
President Jagdeo, hello. President Jagdeo is pushing himself forward to educate you all.
No.
Go ahead.
The thing is that I just wanted to step in, since we want to get it a bit more controversial. During lies what I think is the problem. Chile is very different than the region, not in terms of the indicators we just mentioned, but Chile's population is bigger than the whole of the Caribbean combined. Secondly, Chile, a single hurricane can wipe out, has a systemic impact. It passes over a whole country, wipes out the equivalent of nearly 100% of GDP. 10 years of exports from a country. Thirdly, Chile Chile has a complex economy. We have monoculture, basically, 2 or 3 sectors that are all declining that create the bulk of our wealth. And we cannot, the way Chile and the others do, navigate the organizations like the WTO. One time I said to President Obama, how do you expect a country like St. Kitts and Nevis, with maybe 50,000 people now, could compete with the United States of America in the WTO using the same rules when in a single building in New York, you have more than 50,000 people working? Yet we face now with the WTO rules that are the same, because reciprocity, the preferences that we had are all gone, and those preferences helped us. It's not like we were looking for a free lunch. So the global system has to change, and therefore we have to change, but the system, if we work hard in, the global system has to change the way it sees us too, as a unique group of countries with peculiar challenges that are different than similar countries, maybe with the same per capita GDP, very different.
Thank you. I wanted one of the people at the back. Is it you? Well, oh no, but go on with your question.
A quick question for our 2 former prime ministers.
In terms of your history in the past, you cannot ask a short question, but try for it.
Can both of you tell us what were the 3 things that you would have done differently if you were not bound by what President Jagdeo probably was referring to as the Washington Consensus, to achieve the economic diversification which you're implying would be the right way to go forward? In other words, how to achieve industrial self-discovery. Yes, I'm done.
Thank you very much, Mr. Golding. And maybe you could...
Not quite sure I understand the question. The fact of the matter is that our circumstances would not have provided us with that sort of flexibility or those options. I think what we have done is what had to be done. And can I just segue from that to address the question that Peter Blair Henry raised? I think we have come too far. We have lifted too much heavy weight, and we still have some more weight to lift. To ever run the risk of that being reversed by some future government that may have a different disposition. And one of the dangers that we face, is that if the program succeeds, as we hope it will, you could end up with a government that feels that the rules are no longer necessary, that they are now free to move in an expansionary mode. And that's why I believe that even as much as we have done well, I believe that our rules need to be secured for the future. I am concerned, for example, that the rules have no sanctions. I'm concerned, for example, that the rules still allow the minister to go to Parliament and with a simple majority, which he enjoys by virtue of being minister, to simply move the rules, move the goalposts in the future. I would like to see a constitutional provision, not the targets in the Constitution, but the ceilings. So your target may very well be 60% of debt to GDP. Your ceiling may be 100, but it would have to have the flexibility to address the hurricanes that Barrett is talking about, to address the external conditions over which we have no control. When I was in office, for example, 3 of our 4 alumina refineries shut down. aluminum bauxite accounted for 50% of our exports, and 3 of our 4 refineries shut down. Now, you must have flexibility to deal with things like that. But I believe in order to preserve the gains and to secure the future, that you should require a qualified majority in moving those ceilings, so that if your ceiling is 100% and circumstances require that you move it, you would need to have your 2/3 majority in both houses of parliament, which requires consensus. We have strong consensus now, and as we get closer to achieving the targets that we have set, I would like us to consider using that consensus to lock into the Constitution not the targets, but appropriate ceilings.
Thank you. Favor, you have a question? Sorry. Can you people just tell me who they want to ask questions, because we're running out of time, even in this well-moderated session.
Good morning, everyone. This is directed at Mr. Biles. First off, I want to congratulate you on being named Man of the Year, well deserved.
Thank you.
But in your opening remarks, you said that the government of the day spent some US $230 million in a suboptimal way on the increase in the tax threshold. And I believe you said this without mentioning the fact that the increase in the tax threshold was done in a revenue-neutral way that caused a shift towards more indirect taxes that has helped to broaden the tax base and has created a more efficient tax structure. And so the conclusion is that we strongly disagree that that is an example of a suboptimal decision, and just wanted to make the correction for the records. Thank you.
Very good.
Sorry,
Do you want to correct her?
No.
I mean, please remember that this is not just a Jamaica thing to fight amongst ourselves.
Yeah,
it is the whole Caribbean.
So, Favor,
right?
Thank you for that remark. But I thought that when I spoke, I made it clear that that action was within the fiscal rule, meaning it was funded. The point I'm making, though, is if I'm in a country with scarce resources, am I going to take 230 million US that I've raised, yes, to spend on that or spend on something that is more optimal? That's the only point I'm making. I accept that it was funded and it fell within the Responsibility Act. But could we have spent it on something that is more impactful to growth and development in the country?
Okay, thank you very much for the little warfare that is going on. Does anybody have another question they want to ask? Yes, sir. Who are you, sir? Can't see you because of the light.
Van Seymour from St. Kitts and Nevis. We are talking generally and maybe specifically in some cases about growth and development and strengthening resilience. But countries within the Caribbean region, and certainly St. Kitts and Nevis, we need to grant concessions, give up some of the tax to encourage investment, to stimulate growth. How does this square against what we are speaking about, fiscal responsibility or irresponsibility, and seeking to generate economic growth, to deal with the issues, unemployment among youth, unemployment generally? How do we mix those two things up?
Well, can I ask you, how do you deal with it?
Well, we grant the concessions, and we seek to provide the investment, whether it's in new businesses or in tourism or whichever area will provide the jobs which are necessary. And we look long term, we give up some of the tax, we forgo some taxes to get that investment. Sometimes we get questions asked about the impact on the balance, the budgetary balance and so on. But I think there has to be that trade-off, because if growth and resilience are necessary to protect and to deal with some of the issues we've discussed this morning, then we cannot ignore those. We'll have to find a way of engaging in that balance to get where we want to get in the region.
How do you assess spending public funds for your party's benefit as against the long-term economy of the country? How do you judge that?
for my party's benefit?
Well, I mean, every election, governments spend a lot of public funds to get votes. I mean, that's normal in a democratic society. Do you do that? I mean, sorry, no, I'm not asking if you do it. I'm asking for your advice as to how you handle it.
Well,
Caribbean.
Within St. Kitts and Nevis, we try, well, yes, government coming to elections, you've got projects you have to implement to continue the forward thrust in the economic growth and development. And I do not agree that those projects or expenditure on projects like that, because it's an election period, should be foregone. Otherwise, we are doing the very things that we are advocating against. If a policy has been put in place and a program has been put on the table to provide ongoing development and employment, then there should be no valid reason to stop them from being implemented simply because they may provide some support or get support for the government in power. I don't think that.
I think that's a very moderated and good answer. But if I can test your patience, is there a role for the region to take some interest in the region's debt of individual countries? I mean, if I was asked to define the Caribbean, it wouldn't be unleashing growth and strengthening resilience. It would be unleashing debt and challenging resilience of the people. Is there a regional, can the region deal with it somehow?
But I think it's important that we manage debt and control debt. But you're not going to get the resources to bring down the debt unless you create economic activity. And we cannot forego that. So there is some balancing activity which must take place. And while we do not want to see debt spiral out of control again, say in St. Kitts and Nevis, where we were at 200% of GDP, debt to GDP, and we're now getting back to the prescribed position, I do believe that there has to be some consideration for some debt creation where it is necessary so that we can have growth spurred to provide the revenue streams again and employment levels to keep the countries stable and keep things in forward motion.
It seems to me that St. Kitts should be very glad to have you as a leader. Would you say that?
Oliver,
sorry.
I want to jump in.
Can I remind you?
You can't hug.
Can I remind
the panel?
Can I remind you that you're the moderator, you're not a panelist? Very quickly on that point. There's a danger, there's a serious danger with incentives. The Jamaican experience is that we found that after a while they accumulated. We had some incentives that were put in place from the 1960s when the environment and the need was completely different. And we found that it became almost impossible to wean some of the beneficiaries of these incentives. So I believe that governments must have the flexibility to provide incentives where it is important for growth. But I believe it's also, two things are important. One is there must be limits. It has to be contained so that it doesn't become a major source of revenue loss. And secondly, which happily we have introduced here in Jamaica, is to make it transparent. So that I think it's every month the Minister of Finance has to publish a list of all the waivers that he has granted in the course of that month. So that, because if not, it could be a route to corruption. So I take your point, and certainly in a country that is as dependent as you are on tourist investment, certainly I think we have to recognize there's a need for government to do that, but you have to be careful that it doesn't become cancerous.
Yeah, I think it's another orthodoxy that we are fighting, and I was asked about the Washington consensus at the beginning. There is a prevailing orthodox view that low tax rates would naturally crowd in investments without any exemptions. And the reality that is from the technical people, without any exemptions, low tax rates, that it would distort concessions, would distort the market, etc. If concessions are given to individuals based on their political affiliation, that could happen, or distort the market in sectors. But from a policymaker's perspective, it's very different. When an investor comes to you and can hop over to Grenada, I shouldn't be using Grenada, Keith is here, but say some other country, Dominica, and they come to St. Kitts, and they're willing in say, Dominica to give them the concessions that they ask for, then that investor will go to Dominica. You can't be competitive any longer because you now lost the investment because another country is willing to give that investment. And it's not revenue you're giving up now, it's future revenue. It's future revenue. You're not giving up taxes. You're giving up future revenue to the Treasury. But the trade-off is jobs, which sometimes is the problem. Jobs and growth. And so these things from a policymaker's perspective, when you sit in that chair, is very different than a technical paper being presented to you about how wonderful these tax issues are. We've seen in the developed world, the government help to keep, by giving concessions, a car plant open, Boeing going, etc., because they believe that this is important for those countries. And in this case, we can't just take away the tools. I agree that the tools must be monitored carefully and there must be transparency in the use of the tools, but not to take away these tools, etc. And that, you asked about the Washington Consensus, what we would have done differently. I'm not advocating anything different. I still believe in our model that there's primacy of the market and the private sector. I just believe that the model has to take account of our specifics that are different. So when the United States ran into trouble in the last crisis, the IMF and the others said you should spend more. We needed to boost global demand because we were going into crisis. When you have to have a similar sort of flexibility, and Madame Lagarde is here, that's the puzzle you were talking about. Why is it puzzling? It's just that we can't develop without the help of the international community. We would have made no progress in Guyana had it not been the fund changing and the IFIs changing their position on debt relief. We would have made no progress. The growth, the 10 years of sustained growth we have had in the past, is because we managed to tackle the debt with the help of the international community. So I'm not proposing a model that's fighting the international community, working in collaboration with them to address these problems.
Richard, your epoch thing was monitoring, what was going on. The IMF, as I understand it, may well jump out of Jamaica in 2 years' time. What are your suggestions about, what happens after that? Are you gone from epoch? I don't know if you were fired, like from your job, or...
Yes, I'm gone from epoch.
Well, what's your proposal for the future?
Well, that's what I thought I was saying in my opening remarks. So you were asleep, Oliver. It's really to emulate the epoch model, which is to create a little independence, transparency around the issue of the budget, how it is comprised, to try to maximize efficiency. In a resource-starved economy, we have to do the best we can to use our resources as best as possible. And I think that the fiscal responsibility rule sets broad guidelines, and that's great. And let me tell you, I'm a fan of the fiscal responsibility rule, but it's not good enough. We have to find a way in Jamaica and in the Caribbean territories to be more professional and to be more business-like with how we allocate resources and how we spend them. And I think that the idea out of Chile, where you can embrace the administration of the fiscal rule with a committee of professionals, of independent-minded persons, to assess what is going on and express an independent opinion, is something that we could benefit from.
Can I just say to Andrea, your committee is appointed by the Minister of Finance, so aren't you highly politicized from the start?
Well, as I said recently, this has been a slow reform, and I think this could be an advice for every country. Chile has started building budget surpluses in the 80s, and started using informally this rule of some sort of permanent income to figure out how much the government could spend, I don't know, 30 years ago. It became a rule in 2001, and it was written into law in 2006. The Fiscal Council was created in 2013. So this has been a step-by-step process. You have to give up some of your fiscal discretion. You're also delegating part of your mandate to a body that is specialized, that is independent. So there's always a bit of a position on building this, and you can do this step by step.
Sorry, just stop.
Sure.
The boss wants to say something. Go ahead.
You.
Oh, I thought you put your hand up. I mean, you're allowed to talk here, you know. Are you sure? Huh? Because I'll stop this lot and listen to you. No? Okay. Go ahead.
So we haven't gone all the way. What you just said is right. The Fiscal Council in Chile is not independent yet. It was created by a decree. It's not created by law. The 5 people, the 5 members, are local fiscal experts that have been chosen by the government. There's people, it depends on people being really professional and trying to be as independent as they can, but we have been picked by the government, and our mandate ends with the government, and there's going to be another administration and another fiscal council, but that's probably the next step. We've been building this one by one, and I guess this will be the next one.
Yeah, well, just to observe that Grenada is Prime Minister Mitchell here? Grenada, which followed Jamaica. They introduced fiscal rules in 2015, I think it was. But they went a step further. They actually put into law the fiscal oversight arrangements. And I just saw in the media, I think it was last week, where the members of that committee had received their instruments of appointment from the Governor General, which means that it's now fairly statutory. But I come back to this concern that you have it in law, but governments go to Parliament regularly and change laws. And therefore, it's something that I think that we should really apply our minds to. How do we... You see, right now, our fiscal rule situation is embedded in soil, not in concrete. And I think that we should give serious consideration to how do we ensure that our grandchildren won't have to suffer the consequences of some government between now and when they become sensible, decide to reverse all of what we have at such great pain achieved over and still hope to achieve more.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. In fact,
No. Who are you?
Oh, okay. So Timothy Antwine, Governor Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, and formerly the Financial Secretary.
You run things better down there than up here?
If you say so, sir. Thank you.
I did not say so. I asked you.
I wanted to intervene on the matter that former Prime Minister Golding raised, having worked on the fiscal responsibility law in Grenada, to precisely what you said. 2 points. So the Fiscal Responsibility Oversight Committee is set up by Parliament, completely independent. It's currently chaired by a banker in the private sector, a lawyer, somebody from the central bank, and 2 other persons, completely, and they report to Parliament. So I think that's a step forward. Secondly, I do agree with you about the concerns about lack of sanction and about the fact that it's in law, not in the Constitution. In 2011, the law was passed in Grenada in 2015. In 2011, I called publicly for it to be put in the Constitution. But that's a very high bar. And constitutional reform is very difficult in this region, as you know, because it requires bipartisan support. So while I agree with you, and I hope we can get there, in the interim, what was done in Grenada, which I support and advocate, is that you get it into law, get an independent panel. My final comment is that the ultimate sanction of this law, for this law, is the people. The people have to demand fiscal responsibility. And by the way, I call it fiscal resilience because of hurricanes and all the disasters and shocks that we face. It's not just, I think too many people see it as handcuffing the governments, rather than I see that empowering you to actually implement counter-cyclical fiscal policy. But the people must be the ultimate sanction, the ultimate custodian, if you will, of the law. They have to demand it. And that is why the conversation has to include social partners to be able to engender that kind of support from the population. So no government can go into parliament with a majority and just simply arbitrarily change the law because they have the majority. Thank you, Chair.
I agree with you entirely. But I think too much is at stake to leave it to the possibility of a government having won an election with an overwhelming majority, and therefore to convince itself that it can afford to. In our case, let me just tell you very quickly, Section 7, Chapter 7 of our Constitution deals with public finances. It is an entrenched section, which means that in order to amend it, you would need to have 2/3 in both houses, which requires bipartisan consensus. My own view is that these arrangements could be put in that section, and I'm saying this based on the fact that there is political consensus between the government and opposition about the importance of these rules, with appropriate flexibility, of course, to deal with emergencies. And all of this could be done within a period of 9 months, based on the requirements for amending that kind of section in the Constitution.
Richard, you want to say something? Quick, though.
Yes, very quickly. One of the ways in which EPOC was able to have some, so to speak, influence was because it made these public presentations regularly, every month. And I think that is one of the ways in which we can give sanction to Fiscal Responsibility Council or Citizens Committee, whatever we call it. Give them the right to speak independently to the public. And I think that endows them with power that, if used responsibly, is quite powerful.
We're going to wind up now. You have a minute.
Thank you. I'd just like to wrap up saying that there's no one ideal fiscal policy rule for every country in every time, in every point of time. You have to, it depends on the shocks, how large they are, how frequent they are, how long-lasting they are. So I guess every country has to think about whether there's consensus enough to have a rule and to build one that is sensible, to make it credible. There are these all other institutions that can help on the way, like the Fiscal Council, but you have to start with something that makes sense to your country, and that it's a rule, and at the same time it's flexible enough so you can think of how times change and the needs change over time. Thank you.
Bruce?
Just one final point. I don't think that we spent enough time during the conversation on the question of the...
Well, let me just explain. If the previous meeting had been run properly, we'd have had more time, you know?
I don't know. I'm talking now about the question of the depth of penetration of these rules. I think Richard alluded to it when he raised the question of the tax concession. Because you can have fiscal targets and you can meet the fiscal targets, but you do so at the expense of your public investment, and you chop your capital expenditure in order to get your numbers back in line. Now, I'm not suggesting that should be some constitutional requirement, but I do believe that in the rules that we set, perhaps we need to look at how do we preserve the public investment component of your expenditure to ensure that you build for the future rather than just meet what some may very well argue are arbitrary targets.
I agree with the need for fiscal rules. I agree that they should be enshrined probably even in the Constitution, but definitely legislatively. But fiscal profligacy is not the biggest challenge of our region, and it is not in fact, I believe it's one of the conditions that is less than others. It's that are affecting growth and development in our region. And we can't avoid the conversation of the model that we jointly have to work with on both sides, the IFIs and our region, and both sides are delinquent on the model. We will go through this in cycle. We'd see a period of growth and development, and then long periods of low growth, lack of development, and the challenges are greater for the region. We've been advocating this for the last 10 years. We were successful in some areas, but it's a mindset we are fighting on both sides. And I don't believe, unless we work on that model, we're not going to make the sustained progress in this region that we want to. And we continue to have crime and migration and drug trafficking.
Do you think that you made a mistake in putting a term limit in and kicking yourself out?
No, I signed it into law.
Okay. I think it might have been a mistake. Go on, Mr. Bile. No, I'm good. That's it. Give these people a hand. They're by far the best panel you'll ever have. May I thank you all for coming. Goodbye.
Thank you so much, Mr. Moderator. Oliver Clark, the chairman of the Gleaner Company. Thank you to all the panelists as well. The former president of Guyana, Barrett Jagdeo, the Honorable Bruce Golding, former Prime Minister of Jamaica, Mr. Richard Biles, chairman of the Sagicor Group and former president and CEO of Sagicor Group, as well as Andrea Repetto, the president, Chile Fiscal Advisory Authority. We break now for lunch, and you have been advised where we will have lunch in the hotel. During lunch, we'll have a key...
The 2017 High-Level Caribbean Forum now on at the Jamaica Pegasus Hotel in New Kingston under the theme Unleashing Growth and Strengthening Resilience. That session focused on fiscal policy and political cycles and how to keep these policies on track once a new political directorate takes over. There was a small to and fro involving State Minister and the Ministry of Finance, Favor Williams, and Sagicor Group Chairman Richard Biles. The State Minister rejected Mr. Biles' suggestion that the $230 million tax break implemented by the JLP after it took office may not have been an optimal decision. Former Prime Minister Bruce Golding, who was also part of the panel, had this suggestion, this food for thought. He suggested that countries consider the path taken by Grenada, which has enacted into law the fiscal oversight rules that were implemented under its IMF program. And with that, we take a break and send you back to studio at PBCJ for the news.
News. Current affairs.